Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been hesitant to share this for years. My wife thinks I should just let it go, but I can't. What happened that night in January 3 years ago changed how I see the woods around our home forever. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. I just need to get this off my chest. We live about 8 miles outside of Oak Ridge in a house that my grandfather built back in the 70s. It's nothing fancy. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a wraparound porch that needs constant maintenance. The property is about 4 acres, but most of it is dense forest. We've got maybe half an acre cleared around the house with a gravel driveway that stretches about 100 yards to the county road. That night, we were coming home from my daughter Emma's basketball tournament in Eugene. It was around 9:30 in the evening, and January in Oregon means it gets dark early. I remember it was especially dark because there was no moon and heavy cloud cover. We'd left our dog Rex outside like we usually do when we're gone for the day. He's a German Shepherd mix, about 90 pounds, and he loves patrolling the property. Never had any problems before. As I pulled up to the house, I noticed all the outside lights were off. I swear I'd left the porch light on before we left that morning, but power outages aren't uncommon out here, especially in winter. The headlights of our SUV were the only illumination as I pulled up to the house and stopped about 20 feet from the front steps. "I'll run in and get the lights," I told Sarah, my wife. Emma was asleep in the back seat, and my son Tyler, who was 12 at the time, was playing some game on his phone. "Hurry up, it's freezing," Sarah said, pulling her coat tighter. It was probably around 28 degrees that night. I remember stepping out of the car and immediately feeling uneasy. It was quiet, too quiet. Normally Rex would be right there greeting us, barking his head off the moment he heard the car coming up the driveway. But there was nothing. I left the headlights on and walked toward the front door, fishing in my pocket for the house keys. That's when I heard it. Rex barking, but not his usual excited bark. This was different, aggressive, alarming. The kind of bark that makes the hair on your neck stand up. The barking was coming from somewhere behind the house, in the direction of the back corner of our property where the forest gets really thick. I stopped on the porch steps and turned to listen. Rex was clearly chasing something. His barks were getting closer, moving fast along the tree line that borders our yard. "Michael, what's going on?" Sarah called from the car. "I think Rex is chasing something," I called back. "Stay in the car." I stepped back off the porch, moving toward the side of the house to try and see what was happening. The barking was getting louder, more frantic. Then I heard crashing sounds coming from the woods, breaking branches, rustling underbrush. Something big was moving through there, and Rex was in pursuit. I remember thinking it was probably a deer. We get them all the time. Or maybe a bear, though they're usually hibernating in January. I was concerned for Rex. He's protective, but not stupid enough to tangle with something that could hurt him. I was about to call out for him when the crashing got louder. Whatever it was heading straight toward our front yard, toward me and my family in the car. Then it happened. About 30 yards away, where our yard meets the forest, something burst through the underbrush. It entered the edge of the headlight beams, and my entire body went cold. My first thought was that someone was trespassing, some hunter cutting across our property. But in that split second, as it moved fully into the light, I realized how terribly wrong I was. The figure was tall, at least 7 feet. It was covered in dark fur or hair that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The fur wasn't uniform, thicker on the shoulders and back, sparser on what I could see of its chest and limbs. But what struck me most was how it moved. It was unmistakably bipedal, running on 2 legs with a smooth, coordinated gait that was both familiar and deeply wrong at the same time. Its arms were long, too long, and swung with its stride in a way that seemed almost deliberate. I could see muscles rippling under the fur with each movement. It had power. It had purpose. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds, this thing was fully illuminated in my headlights. I couldn't make out its face. It never turned directly toward me. But I saw enough of its profile to know this wasn't a person in a costume. The proportions were all wrong. The way it moved was too fluid, too natural. Then, without slowing down at all, it changed direction. It was like watching a running back make a cut on a football field. This massive creature just pivoted and veered sharply back into the forest on the other side of our yard. It disappeared into the darkness, with Rex still barking and chasing after it. I stood there frozen. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My brain was trying to process what I'd just seen, but nothing made sense. "Michael!" Sarah's voice finally snapped me out of it. She had rolled down the window and was staring at me with wide eyes. What the hell was that? I ran back to the car and got in, locking the doors immediately. "What was it?" she asked again. "Was that a person?" "No," I said, my voice shaking. I don't know what it was." Tyler was now pressed against the window, trying to see into the darkness. "Dad, was that a bear?" "It wasn't a bear," I said firmly. "Bears don't run on 2 legs." We sat there in the car with the engine running and the headlights on, nobody wanting to get out. Emma had woken up and was asking questions, but I couldn't find the words to explain what I'd seen. How do you tell your 10-year-old daughter that you just saw something impossible? After about 15 minutes, Rex finally came trotting back into the yard. He was panting heavily, his tongue hanging out, and he kept looking over his shoulder every few steps. I flashed the headlights, and he came running up to the car. I cracked the door, and he immediately tried to force his way in, something he never does. Rex is well trained and knows he's not allowed in our car. But that night was different. He was scared. This 90-pound dog that had chased off coyotes and confronted black bears was whining and trying to crawl into my lap. I finally got out of the car with Rex practically glued to my leg. I unlocked the house and turned on every light inside and outside. Sarah rushed the kids in while I stood on the porch, scanning the tree line with Rex still pressed against me. Once inside, we locked every door and window. Rex refused to go outside again that night, even to do his business. He kept pacing from window to window, growling softly at the darkness outside. This dog, who normally patrolled our property all night, was terrified to leave the house. We didn't talk much that night. The kids went to bed after I assured them it was just a weird animal they didn't need to worry about. Sarah and I stayed up, sitting at the kitchen table with mugs of tea that went cold. "What did you see out there?" she finally asked in a whisper. I described it as best I could, the height, the fur, the way it moved. "Like a person?" she asked. "Not like any person I've ever seen," I replied. "But yes, on 2 legs, running, fast." "Bigfoot?" She said it with a nervous laugh, but I could tell she was serious. I shook my head. "I don't know. I don't believe in that stuff. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't a bear, wasn't a person, wasn't anything I can explain." The next morning, I went out at first light to look for tracks. The ground was partially frozen but soft enough in places that something should have left marks. I found Rex's paw prints, easily enough, but where the creature had run through our yard, there was nothing definitive. Just some disturbed areas in the frost and a few broken branches at the edge of the woods. Nothing I could point to and say, "See, this is proof." We never saw it again. But things changed after that night. Rex wouldn't go into certain parts of our property anymore, especially after dark. He'd stand at the edge of the yard and growl at the trees, refusing to go any further. For months, I'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking I heard something moving outside our windows. I installed security cameras and motion sensor lights around the entire property. The cameras never caught anything unusual, But twice the motion lights at the edge of the woods went off in the middle of the night when there was no wind or visible animals. Sarah wanted to move, but this is my family home. We've been here for generations. I couldn't just leave because of one unexplainable event, no matter how terrifying. 3 years have passed, and I still don't know what I saw that night. I've researched local wildlife extensively. I've looked into reports of similar sightings in the Pacific Northwest. Nothing matches exactly what I witnessed. Rex died last summer. Old age, nothing mysterious. Our new dog, a lab mix named Sadie, doesn't seem bothered by the woods at all. Sometimes that reassures me. Other times, it makes me wonder if Rex knew something she doesn't. I still find myself staring out at the tree line when I'm alone at night. Sometimes I think I see movement in the shadows, but it's probably just my imagination. The rational part of my brain tells me there must be an explanation, some unusual animal, some trick of the light and shadow. But then I remember the way it moved, the deliberate swing of those long arms, the ripple of muscles under dark fur, the way it changed direction without breaking stride. And I know, whatever logical explanation I try to force onto that night, none of them fit what I saw in those headlights. I don't go into the woods on our property anymore, not alone, not after dark, and I always leave the outside lights on when we're coming home at night. Because whatever was out there 3 years ago might still be watching, waiting, and I can't shake the feeling that next time it might not run away. Story 2. I still can't believe what happened to me last month. I've been trying to make sense of it, but I just can't. I know what I saw, and I know what I heard, but it doesn't match up with anything I've ever experienced before. I'm not the type of guy who believes in monsters or anything supernatural, but this has really messed with my head. So I live out in the sticks in Riverside County, California. Not quite the middle of nowhere, but definitely rural enough that there's no streetlights and you can actually see the stars at night. I've lived here most of my life, so I'm used to the wildlife and the sounds of the countryside after dark. It was a Friday night, around 11 o'clock. I was heading over to my buddy Jake's place to hang out, have a few beers, maybe play some video games. Nothing special. The walk to his house is about 20 minutes from mine, and I've done it hundreds of times, day and night. There's this open field I cut through as a shortcut, just a big stretch of dry grass with a small cluster of trees off to one side near the river. I know every inch of that path like the back of my hand. That night was clear, with a 3/4 moon, so visibility was pretty good. I wasn't using my phone flashlight or anything, just walking along like I always do. I was about halfway through the field when I noticed something off. There was something by the tree line that I hadn't seen before. At first, I thought maybe someone had dumped some trash or an old appliance out there. People sometimes do that, unfortunately. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't trash. It was something standing there, completely motionless, like unnaturally still. My first thought was that maybe it was a deer or an elk, but it didn't look right for that either. It was too tall, too bulky. For a second, I wondered if it might be a bear, but we don't really get bears around here. I stopped walking and just stared at this thing for maybe 10 seconds. It was dark, but I could make out its silhouette against the moonlight. It was definitely solid, not just a shadow or my imagination playing tricks. And it was big, taller than a person, maybe 7 or 8 feet high. But the shape was all wrong. I can't really describe it other than to say it didn't look like any animal I've ever seen. It wasn't exactly person-shaped either. The proportions were just wrong. I considered turning back, but Jake's place was closer at that point than my own house. Plus, whatever this thing was, it wasn't moving. I figured maybe it was just a stump or a fence post that I somehow hadn't noticed before, even though I'd walked this route so many times. So I decided to keep going, but slower, keeping my eye on this thing. I'd only taken a few more steps when it moved, And when I say it moved, I mean it moved. 1 second it was completely still, and the next second it had turned around to face me with this unnatural speed that made my stomach drop. It was so fast that my brain couldn't process the movement properly. It was like watching a video that skipped frames. Then it looked at me. I couldn't see eyes or a face or anything like that from where I was standing, but I felt it looking at me. It's hard to explain, but I just knew with absolute certainty that this thing was staring right at me, aware of me. Before I could even think about what to do next, it let out this sound that I will never ever forget for as long as I live. It wasn't a growl or a roar or any animal sound I've ever heard. It was a scream, a loud, piercing scream that didn't sound animal or human. It was this high-pitched, almost electronic-sounding shriek that seemed to drill right into my ears and my brain. It was so loud that I instinctively covered my ears, but it didn't help much. And then it ran, not toward me, thank God, but straight into the trees. It moved in this weird, jerky way, like its limbs weren't quite working right. But it was fast, way faster than a person could run, especially through rough terrain like that. The strangest part, the part that still gives me chills when I think about it, is that it kept screaming. The whole time it was running away, it just kept letting out that awful, piercing shriek, non-stop. For almost a full minute, just this continuous scream as it crashed through the trees toward the river. I stood there frozen. I couldn't see it anymore once it reached the denser part of the woods, but I could still hear that terrible screaming echoing through the trees. It started to fade as it got further away, but it didn't stop. It just kept going until it was too far away for me to hear anymore. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking. I felt this overwhelming sense of wrongness, like I'd just witnessed something that shouldn't exist in our world. I don't know how else to explain it. For a few seconds, I couldn't decide what to do. Part of me wanted to run back home, lock the door, and never come out again. But the rational part of my brain kept saying that whatever that thing was, it had run away from me, not toward me. And it was headed deeper into the woods, away from both my house and Jake's place. So I made a decision and started walking again, fast. No, let's be honest, I was practically jogging. I kept looking over my shoulder every few seconds, terrified that I'd see that thing coming back for me. But the field remained empty, and the screaming had stopped. When I reached Jake's house, I was out of breath and sweating despite the cool night air. I pounded on his door harder than I meant to, and when he opened it, he took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "Dude, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. I pushed past him into his house and made sure the door was locked behind me. Then I told him everything while he got me a glass of water. My throat was so dry I could barely get the words out. Jake listened without interrupting, but I could tell he was skeptical. When I finished, he asked if I'd been drinking before I came over, which pissed me off. I hadn't had a drop of alcohol that night. I know what I saw. "Could it have been a mountain lion?" he suggested. "They can scream pretty loud. But I've heard mountain lions before. This wasn't that, not even close. And mountain lions don't stand upright at 7 or 8 feet tall. Maybe it was some tweaker in a costume messing with you," was his next theory. But no person could move that fast or scream that long without taking a breath. And why would someone in a costume just be standing motionless in a field at 11 at night? It made no sense. We ended up spending the rest of the night watching movies and playing video games, but I couldn't focus. Every time there was a noise outside, I'd jump. Jake offered to let me crash on his couch instead of walking home, and I took him up on it. There was no way I was going back through that field in the dark. The next morning, Jake drove me home. We took the long way around, using the road instead of cutting through the field. As we passed near the area where I'd seen the thing, I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see it standing there in broad daylight. But there was nothing unusual visible. Jake must have sensed my unease because he offered to go check out the spot with me. Part of me wanted to say no way, but another part needed to know if there was any evidence of what I'd seen. So we parked his truck and walked out to where I thought the thing had been, standing. There was nothing there, no footprints, no broken grass, no sign that anything unusual had happened. Jake seemed relieved, but it just made me more unsettled. How could something that big not leave any trace? We walked over to the tree line where the thing had run into the woods. Here, finally, there was something, broken branches and disturbed undergrowth leading toward the river. Jake pointed out that it could have been made by deer or other animals, but the path of destruction seemed too wide for that to me. We followed the trail for a little bit, but it led into a really dense, swampy area near the river that was hard to navigate. After slogging through mud for 10 minutes and getting scratched up by thorns, we gave up and headed back. That was a month ago now. I haven't seen anything like that creature since, even though I've forced myself to walk that route during daylight hours a few times. I've tried to research what it could have been, but nothing I've found matches what I experienced. I've thought about reporting it to someone, but who would I even tell? The police? Fish and Wildlife? I don't have any evidence, and I know how it sounds. I'd just come across as some nutjob who saw shadows in the dark. The thing that keeps bothering me the most is the screaming. Why would it scream like that while running away? If it was trying to scare me off, why not come toward me? If it was afraid of me, why announce its location so loudly? It just doesn't make any sense. Sometimes I wonder if maybe it wasn't running away from me at all, but running towards something else, something worse. And that thought keeps me up at night. I still live in the same house, still see Jake regularly, but I don't cut through that field after dark anymore. I take the long way around, sticking to the roads. It adds 15 minutes to my walk, but that's a small price to pay for peace of mind. But even now, sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night with the window open, I swear I can hear something in the distance. Not quite the same scream, but something similar, something calling. And on those nights I close my window, turn on all the lights, and wait for morning. Whatever that thing was, I hope I never see it again. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, standing motionless in the dark, waiting for someone else to walk by. Story 3. I still can't explain what happened at our cabin in Vinton County. My husband Ed and I bought this little getaway spot about 15 years ago, tucked away on Route 278 between Lake Hope State Park and Zaleski. Nothing fancy, just a small 2-bedroom place with a decent kitchen and living room, sitting on about 3 acres of wooded land. We thought it would be perfect for weekend escapes with our kids, somewhere to disconnect from the world and enjoy nature. The locals were friendly enough when we'd stop for supplies in Zaleski, though looking back, there were times when they'd exchange these knowing glances when we mentioned where our cabin was located. One older guy at the general store once asked if we'd heard anything unusual out there, but when I asked what he meant, he just shook his head and said, "Nothing, just curious." I didn't think much of it at the time. About 8 years ago, we had our first experience that I still can't rationalize. It was a Friday night in October, crisp enough that we had the windows open, but a fire going in the wood stove. The kids were asleep in the back bedroom, and Ed and I were watching some forgettable movie on our small TV. It must have been around 11:30 when we heard it. I need to be clear about something. I'm not someone who jumps at every noise in the woods. We'd gotten used to the normal forest sounds, deer rustling through leaves, raccoons chattering, the occasional fox barking. This wasn't any of those. Something ran past our open window. Something bipedal, something heavy. The footfalls were distinct, left, right, but with a weight that made the ground tremble slightly. Whatever it was had to be massive. The steps were too far apart to be human, and the speed was unnerving. It passed by in seconds. Ed jumped up immediately and grabbed the flashlight we kept by the door. I begged him not to go outside, so instead we just shined the light out the window. Nothing. Pitch black beyond the small circle of our flashlight beam. We listened for another 20 minutes but heard nothing else. The regular night sounds, crickets, frogs from the nearby creek, had all gone silent. The next morning, Ed checked around the cabin. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing disturbed. Our kids asked why we looked so tired, and we just blamed it on staying up too late. What else could we say? We convinced ourselves it must have been a deer, maybe one running on its hind legs for some reason. Though even as I'm typing this, I know how ridiculous that sounds. For a while after that, I was nervous about staying at the cabin, but eventually, the memory faded. We continued our weekend trips, and nothing unusual happened for a few years. Then came the screaming. It was summer, maybe 5 or 6 years ago now. A hot July night with windows open all around the cabin to catch any hint of breeze. We'd spent the day hiking and swimming at Lake Hope, and the kids had crashed early from exhaustion. Our 2 dogs, a black lab named Cooper and a beagle mix named Sadie, were stretched out on the living room floor, while Ed and I watched a baseball game. Around 10 o'clock, Ed suddenly muted the TV. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I hadn't heard anything, but Ed has always had better hearing than me. We sat in silence for maybe 30 seconds, and then I heard it too. A faint scream in the distance. It sounded humanish, but not quite. Like someone trying to imitate a woman screaming, but getting the pitch wrong. It was far away, maybe half a mile into the woods. "Probably just a bobcat," I said, though I wasn't convinced. We have bobcats in Ohio, and they can make ungodly sounds, but this wasn't quite right. Before Ed could respond, it happened. A scream so loud and so close, it felt like it was inside the cabin with us. It started as something like a roar, then shifted into a high-pitched wail that didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. It had to be right outside our window, maybe 10 feet away at most. The volume was deafening. I actually covered my ears. The dogs went absolutely berserk for about 2 seconds, then bolted to the back bedroom where the kids were sleeping. These weren't timid dogs. Cooper had chased off black bears from our bird feeders before, but they were terrified. The scream continued for what felt like forever, but was probably 30 seconds or so. It had this strange quality to it, almost like it contained words somehow, though not any language I recognized. There was intention behind it, not just an animal sound. Ed grabbed his flashlight and the baseball bat we kept by the door. I tried to stop him, clutching his arm so hard I left marks, but he shook me off. "I need to make sure the kids are safe," he said, and I couldn't argue with that. He stepped out onto our small porch, sweeping the flashlight back and forth. I stood in the doorway, ready to slam it shut at the first sign of danger. The screaming had stopped the moment Ed opened the door. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the scream. It was complete. No crickets, no frogs, no nightbirds, nothing. Just absolute dead silence, like someone had hit a universal mute button on the forest. Ed stepped off the porch and moved a few feet into our yard, still scanning with the flashlight. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there?" Nothing. Just that unnatural silence. He circled the cabin completely, finding nothing out of place. No footprints in the soft ground around the cabin, no broken branches, no sign that anything had been there at all. When he came back inside, we checked on the kids. Somehow they'd slept through the entire thing, but the dogs were huddled under the bed, shaking. It took hours to coax them out. We barely slept that night, taking turns watching. I wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but Ed convinced me it wasn't safe to drive the winding forest roads at night when we were so tired and shaken. Nothing else happened, and by morning, the forest sounds had returned to normal. We discussed whether to tell anyone about what had happened. Who would believe us? We had no evidence, just a terrifying experience that already seemed dreamlike in the morning light. We decided to keep it to ourselves, but started being more cautious. We stopped letting the kids wander in the woods alone. We began closing the windows at night, regardless of the heat. Ed installed motion detector lights around the property. For a while, nothing unusual happened. We still used the cabin, but I never felt completely at ease there again. I'd find myself listening for unusual sounds, watching the tree line, jumping at shadows. About 3 years ago, I went to the cabin alone with our new dog, Max, a Rottweiler Shepherd Collie mix we'd adopted after Cooper passed away. Ed was on a business trip, and the kids had activities they couldn't miss. But I needed to check on the place after a big storm. I figured having Max with me would help me feel safer. He was young, strong, and protective, the perfect companion for a solo trip. I was wrong. The moment we pulled up to the cabin, Max changed. He'd been fine during the 2-hour drive, sleeping most of the way in the back seat. But as soon as I turned onto our gravel driveway, he sat up and started whining. By the time I parked, he was trembling. I had to drag him from the car. He planted his feet, pulling back against his leash, his eyes wide with fear. When I finally got him inside, he immediately tried to hide. Under the couch, though he was much too big to fit, he ended up wedged halfway under, whimpering continuously. Nothing seemed out of place in the cabin. No signs of break-ins or animal damage from the storm. Just our familiar, slightly musty vacation home. I checked all the rooms, opened windows to air the place out, and tried to convince Max everything was fine. He wasn't having it. That entire afternoon, he refused to settle. He wouldn't eat or drink. When I took him outside to relieve himself, he did his business as quickly as possible, then dragged me back to the door. Inside, he continued pacing, whining, and trying to find places to hide. I planned to stay 2 nights, but by evening, I was reconsidering. Max's behavior was so unsettling that I found myself jumping at every sound. I kept checking the windows, expecting to see something watching from the tree line. Nothing was there, but the feeling of being observed was overwhelming. That night was the longest of my life. Max wouldn't sleep. He kept alternating between growling at the windows and trying to hide. I didn't hear any screams or footsteps, but twice during the night, Max froze completely, staring at the west-facing window with his hackles raised. I looked but saw nothing except darkness. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed our things, closed up the cabin, and left, cutting the trip short by a day. Max's relief when we drove away was palpable. About a mile down Route 278, he finally relaxed and fell asleep. We sold the cabin 2 years ago. We told ourselves and others it was because we weren't using it enough to justify the expense. But the truth was, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in those woods, something that didn't want us there. After we sold it, I started researching the area more thoroughly. That's when I discovered the local legends about Bigfoot sightings in Vinton County going back decades. Reports of strange screams, massive footprints, and creatures glimpsed between trees. Most were from the areas around Lake Hope and Zaleski State Forest, exactly where our cabin was located. I'm not saying I believe in Bigfoot. I'm saying I experience things I cannot explain, in an area with a long history of similar unexplained events. I don't know what was in those woods with us, but I know it was real, it was intelligent, and it wanted us gone. Sometimes I wonder about the family who bought our cabin. I think about contacting them to ask if they've heard or seen anything unusual, but what would I say? Hey, just checking if you've been terrorized by an unidentified forest creature lately? So I keep quiet, and I hope they're okay. I still have nightmares about that scream, about something massive running past our window in the darkness, about my dog's absolute terror at something I couldn't see. I don't go camping anymore. I don't hike in state parks. I've even given away all my wildlife photography equipment. Whatever peace I once found in the forest is gone now, because I know something's out there, something that doesn't appear in any wildlife guide, something that can make the entire forest go silent with its presence. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear that scream again, echoing in my memory. Story 4. I've never told this story to many people outside my family. For almost 50 years, I've tried to make sense of what happened that summer day, but I still can't explain it. I was only 10 years old in 1973, but some memories stick with you no matter how much time passes. It was late July in Victoria, Illinois. Hot, humid, the kind of summer where your shirt sticks to your back within minutes of stepping outside. My parents had let me go camping with my cousin Bobby and two neighborhood friends, Tommy and Dave, at the edge of the old Peabody Coal Company strip mines. We weren't supposed to play there, technically, but every kid in town did. The mining company had reclaimed the land, which basically meant they'd pushed around some dirt to cover up the worst of what they'd done, but it left this weird rolling landscape of steep hills and narrow paths that made for the perfect adventure playground. Our campsite was just a couple of small tents at the edge of the property where my uncle owned some land that bordered the old mine. We had permission to camp there, but our parents had made us promise not to go wandering into the mine area. Obviously, that was the first thing we did after they left. That morning had started normally enough. We'd cooked breakfast over our little campfire, burnt half the bacon, and were planning our day. Bobby, who was 12 and considered himself our leader, suggested we climb to what we called highest peak, the tallest of the hills created by the mining equipment. From up there, you could see for miles around, and it felt like being on top of the world when you're 10 years old. It was around 1 in the afternoon when we started our hike. The sun was beating down, and cicadas were screaming from every tree. The landscape was mostly yellow-brown that summer because we hadn't had much rain, and walking up those steep paths kicked up dust with every step. The hills weren't natural. They had this strange, almost geometric quality because they'd been created by machines rather than nature. Some areas were starting to grow new vegetation, but most was still just hard-packed dirt with patches of scrubby grass. It took us about 45 minutes to reach highest peak. We were all sweating and out of breath by the time we got to the top. I remember the satisfaction of standing there, looking out at the patchwork of farmland and forest beyond the mining area. The hills created this bizarre alien landscape that didn't match anything else around it, like someone had dropped a piece of the moon into the middle of Illinois farmland. We'd brought our canteens and some snacks, so we sat at the top, catching our breath and talking about whatever 10-year-olds talked about back then, probably Star Trek or something. That's when we heard it, this deep, distressed bellowing sound coming from about 150 yards away. "That's a cow," said Bobby, standing up and shading his eyes with his hand to look in the direction of the noise. "There aren't supposed to be any cows out here," Dave said. "This is all mining land." "Maybe it wandered in from one of the farms," Tommy suggested. We all stood up, trying to spot the animal. I was positioned highest on the hill, standing on this little outcropping of dirt that gave me maybe an extra foot of height over the others. That's why I saw it first. Between two of the smaller hills, about 150 yards away, there was a clearing where the mining company had dug particularly deep. As I watched, something stepped out from behind one of those hills into the open space. At first, my brain tried to make it a cow, or maybe a person, but it was immediately clear it wasn't either. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen. Maybe 7 feet, possibly more, and it was white. Not clothes white, but body white, like its skin or fur was this solid, dirty white color all over. The sun was bright that day, making it stand out sharply against the brown hills behind it. But the most unsettling thing was how it moved, completely upright on 2 legs, with a smooth, purposeful stride. Not lumbering or awkward, but confident, like a person walking with somewhere specific to go. "Guys," I said, my voice coming out higher than I intended. "Look over there," I pointed, and they all turned to look. "What is that?" Tommy whispered. As if it heard us, though we were much too far away for that to be possible. The thing stopped walking. Then, in a motion that still appears in my nightmares sometimes, it turned its upper body toward us. Not its whole body, just from the waist up, like an owl might turn its head, and it looked directly at me. I can't describe its face in detail. We were too far away for that. But I could tell it wasn't right, wasn't human, wasn't any animal I recognized. It had a face, eyes, a head on shoulders, but the proportions were wrong somehow. Its arms hung longer than they should have. In that moment, I felt completely certain it was looking at me specifically, making eye contact across that distance. My whole body went cold, despite the summer heat. For several seconds, probably no more than 5 or 6, but it felt like forever, we stared at each other. Then it turned away, not hurriedly or like it was scared, but deliberately, and walked back over the hill it had come from, disappearing from view. None of us spoke for what felt like a full minute. Then Dave broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" His voice cracked in the middle of the sentence. "I don't know," Bobby said. He was trying to sound brave, but I could hear the fear in his voice. "Maybe someone in a costume." "Nobody wears a costume like that in this heat," Tommy said. "And why would they be out here in the middle of nowhere?" "It looked at me," I said quietly. "It knew we were watching it." That was enough to break whatever spell had kept us rooted in place. Without discussion, we grabbed our stuff and started back down the hill toward our campsite. We didn't run, the paths were too steep and narrow for that, but we moved as quickly as we safely could. Nobody wanted to fall and be left behind. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I would see that white figure standing on a hill watching us. Every time the wind rustled the sparse vegetation, we all jumped. What had been an adventure playground that morning now felt threatening, the unnatural hills providing countless places where something could hide, watching us. By the time we got back to our campsite, we were breathing hard, not just from exertion, but from fear. We immediately started talking all at once, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. "It was walking like a person," I insisted. "Not like an animal on its hind legs, but like a person walks normally." "But it wasn't a person," Bobby said. "It was too big, too white." "Maybe it was an escaped mental patient," Dave suggested, which was the kind of thing kids in the 70s would say, thinking that crazy people looked or acted inhuman somehow. "In what? A full-body white suit in July?" Tommy countered. "And why would a mental patient be 7 feet tall?" We debated whether to pack up and go home. None of us wanted to admit we were too scared to stay, but none of us wanted to be out there after dark either. Finally, we compromised by moving our tents closer to my uncle's property, away from the mine lands, and building a bigger fire than we normally would have in summer. That night was one of the longest of my life. Every sound from the woods around us had us sitting bolt upright. We kept the fire going all night, taking turns staying awake to watch. I don't think any of us slept more than an hour or two. The next morning, in the safety of daylight, we debated whether to go back and look for tracks or other evidence. In the end, fear won out. None of us wanted to go anywhere near where we'd seen that thing. We packed up and went home a day earlier than planned, making up some excuse about the heat being too much. When we told our parents what we'd seen, they reacted exactly as you'd expect. They smiled indulgently and told us our imaginations had gotten the better of us. My dad suggested it was probably just a deer standing on its hind legs to reach leaves, though that explanation made no sense given what we described. My mum thought maybe it was someone from the coal company checking the land, though she couldn't explain why they'd be dressed all in white or be so tall. For about a month, the 4 of us talked about it constantly when adults weren't around, but we didn't tell anyone else at school because we knew we'd be laughed at. Then something happened that changed everything. My Uncle Jim was reading the newspaper one evening when I was over at their house for dinner. He called me over, pointed to an article and said, "Isn't this like that thing you boys said you saw out by the mine last month?" The article described sightings of something called the Big Muddy Monster in southern Illinois, near the Big Muddy River. According to witnesses, it was a large, white, bipedal creature that walked upright like a human. Some people had seen it near Murfreesboro, about a 4-hour drive from us. The newspaper took it seriously enough to print a full article about it. My hands were shaking as I read. The descriptions matched what we'd seen almost exactly. Uncle Jim must have seen my reaction because he said, "You really did see something out there, didn't you?" "Yes," I said, feeling a weird mixture of validation and renewed fear. Exactly like this. After that, my parents took our story more seriously. They still didn't believe we'd seen a monster exactly, but they accepted that we'd encountered something unusual that had genuinely frightened us. They also made us promise never to go back to the minelands, a promise I was happy to keep. I'm 59 years old now. I've had a normal life, college, career, marriage, kids. But I've never forgotten what I saw that day, and I've never found an explanation that satisfies me. I've researched cryptid sightings in Illinois over the years and found that whatever we encountered that summer day has been seen by others, though rarely and unpredictably. Sometimes I drive past the old minelands when I visit my hometown. They've been more fully reclaimed now, with proper vegetation and even some small lakes where the deepest pits were. It looks almost natural if you don't know what to look for. I never stop, though. I just drive by, remembering that moment of eye contact, across the distance, and wondering what exactly was looking back at me. Story 5. I still can't believe it's been over 10 years since that night, but I remember it like it happened yesterday. Some things just burn themselves into your memory, you know? This is one of those things I've never really told many people about because, well, who would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest. It was back in May of 2013. I was driving home late, around 1 in the morning, after hanging out at my buddy Mike's place watching playoff basketball. We'd had a few beers, but I'd stopped drinking hours earlier because I knew I had a 40-minute drive ahead of me. The night was clear, moon was bright, and traffic was basically non-existent. I was taking Akron Road through Summit County, which is this long stretch that cuts through some pretty dense wooded areas. If you're not from around here, Summit County in Ohio has these patches of forest that feel completely isolated from civilization, even though you're never really that far from town. During the day, it's beautiful. At night, it's different. I had the radio playing low, some classic rock station, and my windows cracked just a bit to let in that cool spring air. Everything was normal. I wasn't tired. I wasn't distracted. I was just driving and thinking about how I needed to get up for work in a few hours. That's when I saw it. About 200 yards ahead of me, something moved across the road. At first, my brain tried to categorize it as a deer. We get a lot of those around here, and they're always darting across roads. But within a split second, I knew this wasn't a deer. Not even close. The thing was massive. When I say massive, I mean impossibly huge. My headlights caught it as it stepped onto the asphalt from the left side of the road. It was tall, so tall that I could see a road sign between its fingers. I'm not exaggerating or making this up. There's a 45 mph speed limit sign on that stretch, and this thing's hand was at the same height as that sign, with the sign visible between what looked like fingers. Its proportions weren't right. I mean, it looked humanoid in the basic sense, head, torso, 2 arms, 2 legs, but everything was just wrong. Too long, too thin in some places, too bulky in others. The color was hard to make out in my headlights, but it seemed dark, maybe grayish or a deep brown. Not fur, not quite skin either, something else. The craziest part? It crossed that entire road in just 3 strides. 3 fucking strides. The road there is a standard 2-lane county road, probably 30 feet across, and this thing crossed it like it was stepping over a garden hose. One moment it was emerging from the trees on the left, the next it was disappearing into the forest on the right, maybe 10 yards from the edge of the road. I slammed on my brakes. I didn't even realize I was doing it until I felt the car skidding slightly. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I was breathing like I'd just run a marathon. I just sat there, engine idling, headlights pointing at the empty road ahead. Part of me wanted to floor it and get the hell out of there. Another part was frozen, unable to process what I'd just seen. I kept staring at that spot where it had disappeared into the trees, half expecting it to emerge again or for something else to happen. 5 minutes passed. Nothing moved except the occasional breeze rustling the leaves. No sounds except my own breathing and the low hum of the car engine. I started to question myself. Did I really see that? Was I more tired than I thought? Maybe those beers from hours ago were still affecting me somehow. But I knew what I saw. It wasn't a hallucination or my mind playing tricks. That thing was real as the steering wheel I was gripping so tightly. My knuckles were white. After gathering my courage, I decided to drive forward to the spot where it had crossed. I don't know why, curiosity maybe, or some stupid need to confirm what I'd seen. I inched the car forward, driving about 150 yards until I reached the area. I pulled over to the shoulder and turned off my engine, but left my headlights on, pointing toward the trees on the right side where the thing had vanished. There was nothing there now, just dark woods and the distant sound of the Cuyahoga River that runs not too far from that stretch of road. I sat there for another 10 minutes, scanning the tree line, listening for any unusual sounds. Nothing. Whatever it was gone, probably headed toward the river. Or at least that's what I told myself. I didn't get out of the car. I'm not stupid. Whatever that thing was, it was huge, and probably not something I wanted to meet up close. Eventually, I started my car again and drove home, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. When I got home, I didn't tell my wife. What would I say? Hey, honey, I just saw Bigfoot's bigger, scarier cousin on Akron Road. She'd think I was crazy or drunk, so I kept it to myself, went to bed and barely slept. The next day, I drove back to that spot in the daylight. I don't know what I expected to find. Footprints, maybe. Some evidence that what I saw was real. There was nothing. The ground was too hard for prints, and if there had been any broken branches or disturbed vegetation, I couldn't identify it from the road. I was too scared to go into the woods alone to look closer. I started researching after that, spent hours online looking for similar sightings in the area. There were a few vague reports of something large seen in the forests around Summit County over the years, but nothing as specific as what I saw. Nothing that mentioned the incredible height or the way it moved. I even anonymously called a local paranormal research group, but they seemed more interested in ghost stories and UFOs than whatever I had encountered. The one guy I spoke to suggested it might have been a grassman, apparently Ohio's version of Bigfoot, but that didn't fit what I saw. This wasn't a hairy ape man. This was something else entirely. For weeks after, I avoided Akron Road. I took longer routes home, adding 20 minutes to my commute just to not drive that stretch at night. Eventually, practical considerations won out, and I started using that road again, but never after dark. To this day, 10 years later, I still won't drive Akron Road after sunset. The hardest part has been the dreams. They started a few nights after the encounter and have never completely stopped. In these dreams, I'm back on that road, but I'm not in my car. I'm standing in the middle of the asphalt, and I can feel something watching me from the trees. Sometimes I see it step onto the road again, those impossibly long legs carrying it toward me in just a few strides. Sometimes I just hear it breathing, a deep, rattling sound that seems to come from everywhere at once. I wake up from these dreams drenched in sweat, my heart racing. My wife thinks I have some kind of sleep disorder, and I've never corrected her. It's easier than trying to explain. Last year, I finally broke down and mentioned it to my doctor during a physical. He referred me to a therapist who specializes in trauma and PTSD. I've been seeing her monthly, but I've never told her exactly what happened. I just say I had a frightening experience on the road years ago. She thinks it was probably a near-miss accident that my brain has exaggerated over time. I let her believe that. It's easier, but I know what I saw. I know it wasn't my imagination or a trick of the light or my mind exaggerating a deer or bear. What I saw that night on Akron Road was something that shouldn't exist in our world, something that defies explanation. The weirdest thing is that occasionally I'll be out somewhere, grocery shopping, at the movies, wherever, and I'll get this sudden feeling of being watched. The hairs on my neck stand up, and I get the same cold fear I felt that night. I'll turn around expecting to see something. But there's never anything there, just normal people going about their day, oblivious to the fact that there are things in this world that we can't explain. Sometimes I wonder if it saw me too, if it noticed my car, my headlights, me behind the wheel. I wonder if it remembers me the way I remember it. That thought keeps me up at night more than anything else. I've tried to convince myself it was just some freak occurrence, a one-time thing that I'll never experience again. But deep down, I know better. Whatever that thing was, it lives in those woods. It's probably still there, moving through the trees at night, crossing roads when it thinks no one is watching. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and can't sleep, I wonder how many other people have seen it. How many others are out there, keeping their own encounter secret because they're afraid of not being believed. Or worse, afraid that talking about it might somehow summon it back. I don't have any answers. I don't know what it was, or why it was there, or if I'll ever see it again. All I know is that the world is stranger and more frightening than most people realize. And sometimes, late at night on a lonely stretch of road, the line between what should and shouldn't exist gets very, very thin. That thing on Akron Road changed me, made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. And I still can't drive that road after dark without my hands shaking on the wheel and my eyes constantly scanning the tree line, afraid of what might step out of the darkness. Story 6. I still get goosebumps when I think about what happened back in 2003. I was 27 at the time, working as a supervisor at a manufacturing plant in southern Indiana. My girlfriend Stephanie and I were carpooling that winter because her car wasn't great in the snow and we were working similar shifts. It was early February, one of those bitter cold Indiana winters where everything's covered in thick snow for weeks. We'd just finished our shifts around 4:30 in the afternoon. The sun was already getting low. You know how winter days are so short. We were driving my old Ford F-150 down State Route 56, taking it slow because the roads were still pretty slick from a snowfall the night before. The heater in my truck wasn't working great, so we were bundled up. Steph was wearing this puffy blue jacket I always teased her about because it made her look twice her size. I remember we were talking about maybe getting dinner at this diner we liked when I noticed something moving along Crooked Creek on the left side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. We see them all the time out there, especially in winter when they're hungry and come closer to roads. But something about the movement caught my attention. It wasn't moving like a deer. "Hold on," I said to Stephanie, slowing down. "Do you see that?" "See what?" she asked, leaning forward to look through the windshield. I pulled over onto the shoulder, the truck's tires crunching in the packed snow. The road was pretty empty that day, probably because of the weather. "Over there, by the creek," I pointed. "Something's walking along the bank." I'd been hunting since I was a kid. My dad took me out for my first deer when I was 12, so I knew the local wildlife. Whatever this was, it wasn't something I recognized immediately. I turned off the engine and told Steph I wanted to get a better look. She thought I was crazy to get out in the cold, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my work gloves from the dash, zipped my jacket up to my chin, and stepped out into the cold. The wind hit me hard as I crossed the road. The temperature must have been in the teens that day, and the wind made it feel even colder. The snow was piled high on either side of the road from the plows, so I had to climb over a small ridge of it to get a clear view of the creek area. That's when I got my first good look at it. About 200 yards away, moving steadily along the frozen creek bank, was something I still can't fully explain. It was walking upright, like a person, but it definitely wasn't human. Its entire body was covered in this reddish-brown hair or fur that looked matted in places. It had to be at least 6 feet tall, maybe taller, with a stocky, powerful build. What really stood out were its arms. They were longer than a person's would be, swinging naturally with each step. And its head had this strange, conical shape, almost pointed at the top, not round like a human head. The snow in that field was deep, probably 18 inches at least. Earlier that week, I'd tried to check my dad's hunting blind and had struggled to walk through snow that deep. But this thing was moving through it like it was nothing, barely slowing down, not laboring at all. I stood there, completely still, just watching. After a minute, I heard the truck door open and close behind me. Stephanie had gotten out too, curious about what had me so transfixed. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. Whether from the cold or fear, I couldn't tell. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But it's not a bear, not a deer, not anything I've ever seen around here." We stood there for several minutes, just watching this thing walk along the creek. It never looked our way, just kept moving with this smooth, purposeful gait. It would occasionally pause, bend down toward the creek bank, then continue walking. I wondered if it was looking for something to eat. The whole time, my mind was racing. I'd heard stories from old-timers about strange sightings in the southern Indiana woods, but I'd always written them off as tall tales or maybe misidentified black bears, which are rare but not unheard of in the area. This was something else entirely. Cars started to pile up behind my truck. Not many, just a couple who probably wondered why someone had stopped on this slippery stretch of road. I didn't want to cause any trouble, so I reluctantly headed back to the truck. "We should go," I told Stephanie, who seemed relieved to get back in the warmth. But I wasn't ready to leave it at that. I knew the area well, grew up hunting and fishing all through these parts. There was a side road about half a mile ahead that cut back toward the creek, passing through a small thicket of trees. If we went there, we might get another look without being so visible from the main road. When we got to the turnoff, I took it without hesitation. Stephanie looked at me nervously. "What are we doing, Eric?" she asked. "I just want to see if we can spot it again," I explained. "I've never seen anything like that before." The side road was barely plowed, so I had to drive carefully. We made it to a spot where the creek passed through a wooded area. I pulled over and cut the engine again. "We'll just wait here a bit," I said. It was heading this way. The sun was starting to set now, casting long shadows through the trees. We sat in silence, both of us scanning the creek bank and the edges of the thicket. Minutes passed, then an hour. Darkness was falling fast, as it does in winter, and there was no sign of the creature. "Maybe it went another way," Stephanie suggested after we'd been sitting there for what felt like forever, the truck getting colder by the minute. I was reluctant to leave, but she was right. It was getting too dark to see anything clearly now, and the temperature was dropping fast. I started the truck and turned on the headlights, illuminating the snow-covered field in front of us. Nothing moved in the harsh light. Before heading home, I decided to check one more thing. I drove to the 2 access points where someone could enter those fields, an old farm gate about a quarter-mile down and a dirt access road further on. I was looking for tracks, footprints, any evidence of what we'd seen. What bothered me most was that I found nothing, not a single track or disturbance in the snow. This made no sense. The snow was deep and powdery. Anything moving through it would leave obvious trails. I'd seen the creature with my own eyes, watched it move through that field, yet there was no trace of its passing. "This is impossible," I muttered, standing at the edge of the field, my flashlight beam sweeping across the pristine snow. We both saw it. It was right there. "Maybe we were seeing things," Stephanie offered, but I could tell she didn't believe that any more than I did. On the drive home, we talked about what we'd seen. Stephanie admitted that at first she thought I was just messing with her, but once she saw it herself, she knew it was real. We promised each other we wouldn't tell many people, who would believe us anyway. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about something my dad had told me years before. The Wilsons, who owned the big farm next to my parents' property, had mentioned seeing something strange in their back fields one winter. My dad had laughed it off at the time, but now I wondered. The next day, I called my dad and casually brought up the old Wilson farm. Without mentioning what I'd seen, I asked if he remembered the Wilsons ever talking about seeing unusual wildlife on their property. "Oh, you mean their Bigfoot story?" Dad laughed. "Yeah, old Bill Wilson swore he saw something walking on two legs through his corn one summer. His wife saw it too, down by their pond. Said it was covered in reddish hair. Everyone thought they were crazy or drinking too much." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. "Did they ever mention anything else strange, like with animals or anything?" There was a pause on the line. "Well, there was that. Business with the coyotes," Dad said. "This was back in the early 90s, before coyotes were common around here. The Wilsons kept finding dead coyotes on their property, not shot or trapped. Looked like they'd been killed by something big. Broken necks, bodies mangled. Game warden couldn't explain it." After talking to my dad, I remembered something else. 2 summers ago, my buddies Mike and Trevor had been camping by the pond on my parents' property. They'd woken up in the middle of the night to loud crashing sounds coming from the old barn. They thought it was maybe kids messing around, but they were too spooked to check it out in the dark. In the morning, they found the barn door broken open. Heavy bags of deer feed had been ripped apart, corn scattered everywhere. One of the support beams was cracked, like something had slammed into it with considerable force. We'd blamed it on vandals at the time, but now I wasn't so sure. All these incidents happened within a few miles of each other. The area is mostly farms, separated by long stretches of woods and creeks. Perfect for something to move around without being seen much. Southern Indiana has some pretty remote spots, places where you could go days without seeing another person if you stayed off the main roads. It's been almost 20 years since that day on State Route 56, and I've never seen anything like it again. Stephanie and I broke up a few years later, unrelated reasons, but whenever we run into each other, there's this unspoken thing between us, this shared experience that neither of us can fully explain. I've gone back to that spot many times over the years, in different seasons. I've walked those creek banks, looked for signs, unusual tracks, anything that might confirm what we saw. Nothing concrete has ever turned up. But sometimes, especially in winter when the trees are bare, I get this feeling of being watched. The thing that still bothers me most is how it moved through that deep snow without leaving tracks. That's not natural. Everything leaves tracks in snow that deep. But this thing, this creek walker, it knew how to move without leaving evidence, like it had been hiding in those woods and fields for years, learning how to stay invisible despite its size. I don't know what we saw that winter day, but I know it was real, and I know it's still out there, walking those creek banks when no one's watching. Sometimes when I'm driving that stretch of road in winter, I slow down and scan the creek bank, half hoping, half dreading that I'll catch another glimpse of the creek walker of southern Indiana. Story 7. I've hesitated to share this for a long time, but I need to get it off my chest. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened to me back in the early 80s in the backcountry of San Diego County. I'm a retired veterinarian, and I've always prided myself on being a rational, science-minded person. But what I experienced out there in Julian defies everything I thought I knew about the natural world. Even now, typing this out with shaky hands, I can feel my heart racing. It all started in February of 1981. My husband had passed away the previous year, and I was still trying to figure out what to do with this new chapter of my life. I'd always been fascinated by cryptozoology, not that I'd admit that to my colleagues, and had heard whispers about strange sightings in the mountains near Julian. Being retired gave me the freedom to finally investigate these stories myself. One afternoon, I was at a small cafe in Julian. chatting with locals about the area when a young Native American man overheard our conversation. He lingered until the others left, then approached my table. "I know where they live," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one could hear. "The Bigfoot, on my reservation. I've seen them many times." I was skeptical but intrigued. He seemed sincere, and something in his eyes told me he wasn't just spinning tales for a gullible old woman. "I can take you there," he offered, "but we have to be careful. The elders don't like outsiders knowing about them." I should have been more cautious. At 67 years old, I wasn't exactly in prime hiking condition. But curiosity got the better of me, and we arranged to meet the following morning. The weather had been terrible that February. Intense storms had washed out roads and caused flooding throughout the county. The young man, I'll call him Michael to protect his identity, picked me up in my van just after sunrise. He directed me down a series of increasingly remote roads until we reached what seemed like the edge of civilization. "The road ahead is damaged," Michael explained, "but your van should make it if we go slow." The road was barely more than a mud track, with deep ruts carved by the recent storms. My poor van groaned and slipped as we climbed higher into the mountains. I white-knuckled the steering wheel, acutely aware that one wrong move could send us sliding off the edge. Michael remained calm, pointing out landmarks and telling me about the history of his people in these mountains. After what felt like hours of nerve-wracking driving, we reached a small flat area where Michael told me to park. "We walked from here," he said. The air was crisp and smelled of wet earth and pine. Michael led me along a narrow trail that descended into a canyon, a dark, sunless place where the trees grew so thick they blocked most of the daylight. The ground was soft underfoot, still saturated from the storms. I followed as best I could, my old knees protesting with every downward step. "There," Michael whispered, pointing to a series of dark openings in the canyon wall. "That's where they live." I squinted through the gloom. The openings did look like cave entrances, but they could have been simple erosion patterns or shadows playing tricks on my eyes. "Let's get closer," I suggested, already moving forward. Michael grabbed my arm. "No," he said firmly. "We don't go there. It's taboo ground. We wait here." He explained that the creatures often came out around this time to drink from natural rock troughs near the road we'd traveled on. His people had observed their patterns for generations. "My grandfather taught me to respect them," he said. "They were here before us." We settled into a spot with a clear view of both the caves and part of the path leading back up to the road. Michael seemed tense, constantly scanning our surroundings. I tried to keep quiet, but my scientific curiosity got the better of me, and I peppered him with questions about the creatures. "They're taller than any man," he told me, "covered in dark hair, but not like an animal's fur. They walk upright like us, and they're intelligent. They use tools, communicate with each other." I was about to ask more when Michael suddenly went rigid. "Listen," he hissed. At first, I heard nothing but the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. Then it came, a low, rumbling sound that I initially mistook for distant thunder. But there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The sound came again, longer this time, almost like a moan or a very deep exhalation. "Is that—" I began, but Michael pressed a finger to his lips. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds had stopped singing. Then came a crack, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking under significant weight. Something was moving through the trees about 100 yards from where we sat. I couldn't see it clearly through the dense foliage, but I could track its progress by the swaying branches and occasional snapping twigs. Whatever it was large. Michael tugged my sleeve. "We should go," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Now." But I was rooted to the spot. Through a gap in the trees, I caught a glimpse of something moving, a dark, massive shape that walked upright. It was only visible for a second or two, but what struck me was how fluidly it moved, nothing like a bear or any other wildlife I'd encountered in my decades as a vet. Michael was already backing away, and I finally snapped out of my trance to follow him. We retreated as quietly as possible, but in my haste I stumbled over a root and let out a small cry of surprise. The forest went completely still. Then came a sound I'll never forget, a high-pitched, almost whistle-like call that echoed through the canyon. It was answered by another call from somewhere to our right, then another from further up the slope. "There's more than one," I gasped. "They're always in groups," Michael said, his voice barely audible. "We need to leave before they surround us." We scrambled back up the trail, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Every few seconds, those calls would ring out, seemingly closer each time. I was gasping for breath, my old legs burning with exertion, but fear drove me forward. As we neared the top of the trail, I heard heavy footsteps behind us, not running, but moving with purpose. I made the mistake of looking back. Standing at the bottom of the trail, partially obscured by foliage but unmistakably there, was a massive figure. It must have been at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms. The setting sun backlit it, turning it into a dark silhouette, but I could make out enough to know this was no human and no known animal species. It made no move to pursue us, just stood watching as we fled. That was somehow more terrifying than if it had charged. The intelligence behind that stillness, the deliberate choice to let us go. We reached my van, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. As we pulled away, Michael kept looking back through the rear window. "They won't follow us out of their territory," he assured me, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. The drive back was a blur. Michael directed me to a different route that avoided the worst of the storm damage. When we finally reached the main road, I had to pull over because my hands were shaking too badly to drive safely. "What exactly did we just see?" I asked him. Michael looked at me for a long moment. "My people have lived alongside them for centuries. We don't bother them, they don't bother us. But the elders won't be happy I brought you there." He was right. When I tried to return a week later after the storms had fully passed, I was met by a tribal spokesman who made it very clear my presence wasn't welcome. He was polite, but firm. I was not to come back to that area of the reservation, but I couldn't let it go. 3 months later, I obtained permission from another tribal member to take photographs on the reservation. I didn't specify which area I planned to visit. This time, I went alone, taking a different route based on what I remembered from my trip with Michael. I never made it back to the canyon. About halfway there, my path was blocked by 5 Native American men who seemed to have been waiting for me. The standoff was tense. They formed a line across the road, and one of them approached my van. "You're the veterinarian," he said. It wasn't a question. I admitted I was. "Michael shouldn't have brought you here," he continued. "This place is sacred." I tried to explain that I meant no disrespect, that I was simply interested in documenting what lived in the canyon. The man studied me for a moment, then surprised me. "I've seen them too," he said quietly, "coming up from the canyon below the flat area. They've always been here, and they should remain undisturbed." After a long discussion, they allowed me to leave peacefully, but made it clear I wouldn't be permitted to continue my exploration. The man's parting words have stayed with me all these years. Some knowledge isn't meant for everyone. Some things should remain mysteries. I made several more attempts over the following months to investigate the Bigfoot presence in the lagunas, but each time I was intercepted by tribal members who seemed to know my intentions before I even arrived. Eventually, I accepted defeat and moved to my late husband's mining claim in Central California. I documented everything in a book called The Night Side of Gold, but it went out of print years ago. Few people know about what I encountered in those mountains, and fewer still believe me. But I know what I saw. That massive silhouette against the setting sun, watching us flee. Those intelligent eyes tracking our movement, the coordinated calls echoing through the canyon. Sometimes at night, I still hear that whistling call in my dreams, and I wake up wondering if they're still there in that sunless canyon, living their lives just as they have for who knows how many centuries, protected by the silence and respect of the people who share their mountains. I'm an old woman now, and I know I'll never return to that place, but I often wonder if Michael ever went back, or if the creatures remember the elderly white woman who stumbled into their territory that February afternoon so many years ago. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, I suppose, but I know what I saw, and nothing, not time, not skepticism, not science, can take that knowledge away from me. Story 8. I've been debating whether to post this for years. I'm not the type who believes in the paranormal or cryptids or whatever. I'm a science teacher, for crying out loud. I deal in facts, evidence, things I can see and touch. But what happened to me 5 years ago in Strathcona Provincial Park still keeps me up at night, and I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone else has seen something similar. I've been backpacking since I was a teenager. My dad took me on my first overnight hike when I was 14, and I've been hooked ever since. By the time I was 32, I'd hiked most of the major trails in British Columbia and Washington. I knew how to handle myself in the wilderness. Bear spray? Check. Food stored properly? Always. Emergency beacon? Never leave home without it. This particular trip was in late September. The weather forecast looked decent. Cool but not freezing, minimal chance of rain, perfect hiking weather. I'd planned a 4-day solo trek into the backcountry of Strathcona Park. It's this massive wilderness area on Vancouver Island, and I'd been wanting to explore some of the more remote lakes there for years. The first day went exactly as planned. I hiked about 15 kilometers from the trailhead, making good time on the well-maintained paths. As I got deeper into the park, the trail became less defined, but I had my GPS and topographical maps. By late afternoon, I reached this pristine little lake that wasn't even named on my map. It was perfect. Crystal clear water reflecting the mountains, completely secluded. Not another soul for miles. I set up camp about 20 meters from the shoreline, on a nice flat spot sheltered by some western red cedars. I had my one-person tent, a small cook stove, and enough food for the trip. After setting up, I collected firewood and built a small campfire in an existing fire ring. Someone had been here before, but it looked like it had been a while. That evening was honestly one of the most peaceful I can remember. I cooked some dehydrated chili, had a couple of nips of whiskey from my flask, and just sat watching the sunset over the lake. The mountains turned this amazing purple-pink color as the light faded. No cell service, no other people, just me and the wilderness. It was exactly what I'd come for. As darkness fell, I noticed how incredibly quiet it was. I've spent hundreds of nights in the backcountry, and there's usually some ambient noise, wind in the trees, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the occasional distant owl. But that night, it was dead silent. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just enjoyed the stillness, watching the stars come out while my fire crackled. Around 10 o'clock, I was getting ready to turn in. The fire had burned down to embers, and I was just about to pour water on it when I heard the first thud. It's hard to describe the sound accurately. It wasn't like a branch falling or an animal moving through the forest. It was deliberate, heavy, like someone dropping a sandbag on hard ground. Then another, and another. Slow, rhythmic thuds coming from across the lake. My first thought was that another hiker had set up camp on the far side of the lake and was doing something with their gear. But the lake wasn't that big, maybe 400 meters across, and I hadn't seen any lights or signs of another campsite. The thuds continued, and I realized with growing unease that they were getting louder. Whatever was making that sound was moving around the lake, toward me. I grabbed my flashlight, one of those heavy-duty ones that can practically turn night to day, and scanned the shoreline across from my camp. Nothing, just dark trees and underbrush. The thuds continued, now clearly coming from the forest to my right, maybe 100 meters away. I'm not easily spooked. I've had close encounters with black bears, even a cougar once. But something about those methodical, heavy footfalls sent ice through my veins. They were too heavy for a person, too deliberate for a bear, and they were getting closer. I added more wood to my fire, building it back up. Some primal part of my brain was screaming that I needed light, needed the protection of the flames. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped one of the larger branches. The footsteps stopped. For maybe 30 seconds, there was absolute silence. Even the fire seemed to quiet down, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then I heard a deep sniffing sound, like something was scenting the air. Something big. I crouched behind my fire, trying to make myself as small as possible while still keeping my eyes on the tree line. The footsteps started again, slower now, more cautious. I could feel them through the ground, actual vibrations with each impact. My flashlight beam danced wildly through the trees as my hand trembled. I tried to steady it, sweeping the light methodically across the forest edge, and that's when I saw the movement. At first, it was just a shifting of shadows, something blocking the trunks of the trees from view. But as I focused the beam, I saw it, a massive dark shape moving between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and bulky, but moving with a weird kind of grace. I remember thinking, that's not a bear. Bears don't move like that. Whatever this was, it was walking upright, bipedal. My mind raced through possibilities. A moose? No, wrong shape. A person in some kind of costume, in the middle of nowhere? It made no sense. The creature paused at the edge of the tree line, just beyond where my firelight reached. I could make out its silhouette now, broad shoulders, a somewhat hunched posture, but still standing at least 8 feet tall. My flashlight beam caught what looked like fur or hair, dark, matted, hanging in clumps from its body. I was completely frozen. My throat had closed up so tight I couldn't even scream if I wanted to. My whole body was shaking, but I couldn't move, couldn't run, couldn't do anything but stare as this thing watched me from the edge of the darkness. Then it took a step forward, and another, moving into the dim outer reach of my firelight. God, I still see it when I close my eyes. That face, it wasn't human, but it wasn't fully animal either. The proportions were all wrong. Its jaw protruded too far, but the eyes were set forward like a human's, deep set under a prominent brow ridge, and they reflected my firelight as yellow-orange orbs, watching me with an intelligence that chilled me more than any mindless animal could have. It tilted its head slightly, studying me. I could hear its breathing now, deep, raspy breaths that clouded in the cool night air. The smell hit me too, like wet dog and something musty and primal that I can't even describe. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me crouched by my fire, this thing standing at the edge of my camp. Seconds, minutes, it felt like hours. My legs were cramping, but I was too terrified to shift position. Then it made a sound, not a growl or roar like you'd expect from a predator. It was lower, more deliberate, almost like speech, but nothing resembling any language I've ever heard. A series of deep grunts and clicks that resonated in its massive chest. When it finished making those sounds, it just waited, like it expected a response, like it was trying to communicate. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. I just stared back at it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. After what felt like an eternity, it made another sound, this one more like a sigh. Then it turned with a strange kind of deliberation and walked back into the forest. Those heavy footfalls grew more distant until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't move for hours. I kept the fire blazing, feeding it every stick within reach. My back was against a tree, bear spray in one hand, knife in the other, though I knew both would be useless if that thing came back. I didn't sleep, didn't even close my eyes. When the first grey light of dawn finally appeared, I packed up faster than I ever have in my life. My hands were still shaking so badly I could barely roll my sleeping bag. I left the ashes of my fire and half-eaten food. I just needed to get out. The hike back was a blur. I practically ran the whole way, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every snapped twig. I made it back to the trailhead by early afternoon, threw my gear in my car, and drove straight home without stopping. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. I kept hearing those heavy footsteps, seeing those reflective, yellow eyes. I told a few close friends, but I could see the skepticism in their faces. I get it. I wouldn't believe it either if someone told me the same story. I researched everything I could about Strathcona Park and Vancouver Island. There are Sasquatch stories from the local indigenous peoples going back centuries, occasional sightings by hikers and campers, but nothing definitive, nothing that could explain what I saw. I've never gone back to that lake. I still backpack, but never alone, and never in that part of the park. I can't. The memory is too vivid, too terrifying. What haunts me most isn't just the encounter itself. It's the way it looked at me, the way it tried to communicate. There was intelligence there, purpose. It wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. It knew what it was doing. It was making a choice. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd responded to those sounds it made, if I'd tried to communicate back. But mostly, I'm just grateful I made it out of there. I don't know what I encountered that night. A Sasquatch, some undiscovered species. I have no proof, no photos, no footprints, nothing but my memory. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I still hear those heavy footsteps approaching through the trees, and I wake up in a cold sweat, wondering if someday, whatever it was might find me again. Story 9. I've been hesitating to share this for almost 4 years now. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest because it still haunts me, and maybe someone else has experienced something similar. My husband James and I are avid hikers. We've been exploring the Pacific Northwest forests for over a decade together. We're not amateurs. We know how to handle ourselves in the backcountry, carry bear spray, make noise on trails, and recognize animal signs. I've seen black bears, encountered cougars at a distance, and dealt with all kinds of wildlife. What happened to us wasn't any of that. It was early October, unusually warm that year. We decided to check out an old favorite trail that branches off from a more popular route. The main trail gets decent foot traffic, but this offshoot goes deep into old-growth forest that few people visit. We'd been there maybe 3 or 4 times before, but not for a couple years. Everything was normal at first. The forest was gorgeous, huge cedars, Douglas firs, that amazing mossy understory that makes everything feel ancient. We were about 2 hours in when James suggested we explore a ravine we'd never checked out before. It wasn't far off our trail, maybe a 1/4 mile through some denser brush. The area felt different immediately. The light was strange, filtered through the canopy in a way that made everything look slightly green-tinted. There was this odd silence, too. Usually, forests are full of ambient noise, birds, wind in the trees, small animals moving around. But here, nothing. I remember thinking it felt like the forest was holding its breath. We pushed through some thick undergrowth and suddenly found ourselves at the edge of something I still can't fully explain. It was massive, a structure unlike anything I've ever seen in nature. My first thought was bear den, but it was way too big and too deliberate. The structure was enormous, easily 15 to 20 feet long and maybe 10 feet wide. It looked like someone had methodically layered cedar branches, moss, dirt, sawdust, and what looked like chewed wood chips into a mound. The materials weren't just piled up randomly. They were woven and compacted together to create a surprisingly solid-looking covering over what appeared to be a large hole dug into the ground. What really disturbed me were the trees around it. 15 to 20 trees had been cleanly snapped or topped at about the 6-foot mark. These weren't trees. blown down by wind or broken naturally. The breaks were fresh, with sap still visible. And they hadn't just fallen, they were arranged. They formed what looked like outer walls and a crude roof structure, creating a sort of funnel-like path that led to the hole. James, being James, immediately wanted a closer look. He walked up to the edge of the structure and stood on a fallen log to peer down at what I now realized was an entrance. I hung back, feeling increasingly uneasy. "This is weird as hell," he whispered. "Look how these branches are twisted together. This isn't random." I was about to suggest we leave when I noticed something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. Inside the black void near James's leg, I saw two silvery black eyes blink in the darkness. Not reflecting light like a nocturnal animal, these eyes had their own dim luminescence, like polished hematite. Before I could say anything, there was a sound that physically shook my body. It was like massive boulders being hurled against trees, 3 sharp, thunderous impacts from somewhere in the forest around us. Boom, boom, boom. Each one felt like it was hitting my chest. James froze. "What the fuck was that?" he whispered, stepping back from the hole. I shook my head, unable to speak. Then it happened again. 3 more impacts. But this time they came from directly beneath us, under the structure James was standing on. The ground literally vibrated, and I felt myself physically lifted for a split second where I stood. It wasn't an earthquake. It was deliberate, like something massive was pounding upward. James jumped back and grabbed my arm. "We need to go now." We started backing away slowly. I whispered, "Maybe it's a bear, some kind of territorial warning." 3 more bone-jarring thuds answered from below the structure, making both of us flinch. Whatever was making that sound was responding to us. It understood what we were saying. James tugged my arm harder, and we scrambled up the embankment away from the structure. As we reached the top, James looked back and his face went white. "Something's coming out," he hissed. I didn't look back. We moved as fast as we could through the brush, no longer caring about being quiet. About 50 yards from the structure, I happened to glance to my right and saw movement. A dark figure running parallel to our path through the trees. It was massive, moving on 2 legs, and seemed to be trying to cut us off before we reached the main trail. We changed direction, pushing through a nearly impenetrable section of Devil's Club and Salal, the thorns tearing at our clothes and skin. I didn't care. The pure animal fear I felt overrode any pain. We finally broke back onto our original trail and didn't stop running until we reached a small clearing about a mile away. Both of us were gasping for breath, scratched and bleeding from the brush. "Did you see that?" James finally managed between breaths. "Something was following us," I said, "running beside us." "No, back at the... whatever that was. When I looked back, I saw something black rising up from the hole. Big, really fucking big." We hiked out at a near run, constantly checking behind us. The silence had been replaced by occasional crashes in the underbrush, always just out of sight. Several times we heard that same thunderous pounding, but more distant now. When we got back to civilization, we called the local conservation officer. We described what we'd found, assuming it must be some kind of elaborate bear den, even though it didn't make sense. The officer listened patiently, then told us bears don't build structures like what we described. He suggested maybe we'd found an old hunting blind or some kind of abandoned human shelter. We knew that wasn't it. This wasn't human-made. The structure was too organic, too integrated with the forest floor, and those trees hadn't been cut. They'd been broken and moved by something incredibly strong. For months afterward, I had nightmares about those eyes in the darkness. James and I talked about going back with a group, maybe in daylight, but we always found reasons to hike somewhere else. 3 years passed. We continued hiking, but avoided that particular area. Then last summer, we joined a group hike with some friends from our outdoor club. The route was about 15 miles from our previous experience, in a different section of the same national forest. From the beginning, things felt wrong. The weather was perfect, but there was that same unnatural silence we'd experienced before. About an hour in, we started hearing strange calls echoing through the trees, high-pitched, almost cackling sounds followed by odd yelping noises. Our friend Mark, an experienced hunter, frowned. "That's not a known animal call," he said quietly. As we continued, people in our group of 7 started reporting hearing noises in the brush beside the trail. 2 women said they felt like we were being watched. I started getting that same overwhelming feeling of fear I'd experienced 3 years earlier, but tried to rationalize it away. Then we came around a bend and found something blocking the trail. A massive uprooted tree stump with exposed roots standing about 6 feet tall. Large rocks had been positioned around it in an arrangement that couldn't possibly be natural. And underneath was another gaping hole that looked exactly like the entrance to the den we'd found years before. Everyone stopped, staring at it. No one said anything for several long seconds. "We should go around," James finally said, his voice tight. As we skirted the obstacle, keeping well away from the hole, I noticed fresh breaks in the surrounding vegetation. Something had been there recently. Our trail descended a steep cliffside, requiring us to use ropes to navigate safely down. I was halfway down when something crashed through the trees nearby with tremendous force. The sound of splintering wood and the impact of something massive moving at high speed froze us all in place. Then I saw it, just a flash really, a black shape crossing the lower part of the trail where it disappeared into a ravine. It moved with a fluid grace that didn't seem possible for its size. I couldn't make out details, just an impression of something tall and powerfully built. Later, when we were safely back at our vehicles, I learned that both James and another woman in our group, Lisa, had seen the creature moments before I did. Lisa was white as a sheet, as she described looking into its eyes. "It had light brown hair," she whispered, "with long fringes down its arms." Throughout our descent and the long hike back to our cars, we heard deep, moaning sounds following us. Even when we reached the parking area, I felt watched from the tree line. These weren't inexperienced hikers prone to panic. They were professionals accustomed to encountering bears and cougars. But whatever stalked us through those woods was different. It was intelligent, territorial, and clearly didn't want us there. I've spent countless hours researching possible explanations. Bears don't build elaborate structures. Cougars don't break trees and arrange them. No known animal creates the kind of deliberately constructed den we found. And nothing I know of makes those bone-shaking impact noises in response to human voices. I still hike, but never alone, and never in that part of the forest. Sometimes at night, I still hear those thunderous impacts in my dreams and wake up feeling the vibrations. I'll never forget those silvery black eyes blinking in the darkness, or the certainty I felt that whatever was watching us from that hole wasn't just an animal. It was something that understood exactly who we were and what we were doing there. Story 10. I've gone back and forth about whether to share this for years. Most people I've told think I'm either crazy or making it up for attention. But I swear on everything I care about, this happened exactly as I'm about to describe it. It's been almost 4 years, and I still get chills thinking about it. This happened when I was 22, visiting my buddy Mike in Jasper County, Mississippi. Mike lived in this old mobile home that his parents owned, about half a mile from their main house. They were out of town for the weekend visiting his grandma, and he invited me over to hang out, play some video games, and have a few beers. The mobile home was pretty isolated, surrounded by dense woods on 3 sides with a dirt road leading up to it. The nearest neighbor was about a quarter-mile away. I'd been there plenty of times before and never felt uncomfortable. The isolation actually made it perfect for staying up late without bothering anyone. That night, we'd been playing Call of Duty and drinking since around 8 in the evening. Nothing crazy, just a casual Friday night. By around 11:30, we were both getting hungry, so Mike threw some frozen pizzas in the oven. While we waited, we switched over to watching some horror movie on Netflix. I think it was one of those found footage ones where people explore haunted asylums or something. I wasn't paying much attention. The only light in the place came from the TV. Mike had these blackout curtains because he worked nights sometimes and needed to sleep during the day. Plus, the trailer had these small windows that didn't let in much light anyway. It made the place feel extra isolated, but I never minded it before. Around midnight, I got up to check on the pizzas. That's when I heard it, a weird scratching sound coming from the front of the trailer. At first, I thought it might be a branch scraping against the metal siding. There were trees nearby, and it had been a bit windy earlier. "You hear that?" I asked Mike. He nodded, turning down the volume on the TV. "Probably just a raccoon or something. They get under the trailer sometimes." But the sound changed. It wasn't random scratching anymore. It sounded deliberate, like something was testing different spots along the front wall of the trailer. Then there was a distinct tap on the front door window. Mike and I looked at each other. "You expecting anyone?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Hell no," he said, sitting up straighter. "Who'd be out here at midnight?" The tapping came again, a little louder this time. 3 distinct knocks. "Maybe it's your parents back early?" I suggested, though it didn't make sense they wouldn't just use their key. Mike shook his head. "They always call first. Plus they wouldn't knock. They'd just come in." I stood up, feeling a weird mix of curiosity and unease. "I'll check," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The layout of the trailer was simple. A narrow hallway from the living room led past a small kitchen to the front door. The door had this small window at eye level, maybe 8 by 12 inches, with thin curtains covering it. I walked slowly down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The scratching had stopped, but I could hear something else now, a heavy breathing sound coming from outside, not like a person who'd been running, but deeper, more rhythmic. When I reached the front door, I hesitated. The breathing was definitely coming from just outside. I reached for the curtain covering the small window and pulled it aside. What I saw in that moment is burned into my memory forever. Pressed against the glass was a face. Not a human face, not an animal face I recognized. It was something else entirely. The face filled the entire window. It had this heavy brow ridge that cast shadows over its eyes, deep-set eyes that looked almost black in the darkness. Its nose was wide and flat, with nostrils that flared as it breathed. But what really got me were the lips, thick and rubbery-looking, pulled back slightly to reveal large square teeth that seemed too uniform to be human. The whole face was covered in short hair, maybe an inch long, that swept back from the forehead. There was this noticeable bump at the top of its head, like a thick ridge of bone or muscle, and the head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. I couldn't see any neck at all. The most terrifying part was that it was looking directly at me. Our eyes locked, and in that moment, I knew this thing was intelligent. It wasn't just some animal. There was awareness there, a consciousness behind those eyes that recognized me as I recognized it. For what felt like minutes, but was probably only a second, we stared at each other. Then it let out a scream. Not like a person screaming, more like a cross between a roar and a howl, but with this guttural quality that made my whole body go cold. The sound was so loud and powerful, it literally rattled the thin walls of the trailer. I could feel the vibration through the floor. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as I scrambled away from the door. "Mike!" I yelled, but he was already on his feet, having heard the scream. "What the fuck was that?" he shouted, his face gone pale. "There's something out there," I managed to say, pointing at the door. "Something, I don't know what it is." We heard a heavy thud against the side of the trailer, like something massive had pushed off from it. The whole structure shook. Mike ran to his bedroom and came back with a .22 rifle that he kept for hunting. "Back door," he said, and I understood immediately. Whatever was out there was moving around the trailer. We rushed to the back door, Mike leading with the rifle. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Mike unlocked the door, and we stepped out onto the small back porch. The night air was cool, and everything was dead silent now. "There," Mike whispered, pointing toward the side of the trailer. Moving along the edge of the woods about 30 yards away was a large, dark figure. Even in the dim moonlight, I could tell it was tall, much taller than either of us. It was moving quickly, but with an odd gait, leaning forward with its arms swinging low. Its hands hung below its knees as it walked. We watched, frozen in place, as it approached a barbed wire fence that separated the yard from the woods. Without breaking stride, it simply stepped over the fence, a 3-strand fence that had to be at least 4 feet high. It didn't jump, just lifted its leg and stepped over like it was nothing. "Should I shoot?" Mike whispered, raising the rifle. I put my hand on the barrel, pushing it down. "No," I said. "Let it go." The creature disappeared into the tree line, the darkness swallowing it completely. We stood there for what must have been 5 minutes, just staring at the spot where it vanished, neither of us willing to go back inside yet. Finally, Mike spoke. "What the fuck was that thing?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but it wasn't human." We eventually went back inside, locking every door and window. We pushed a heavy bookshelf in front of the front door and sat up the rest of the night with the lights on and the rifle across Mike's lap. Neither of us slept. We barely spoke. Every noise from outside made us jump. When morning finally came, we ventured outside to look for tracks or evidence. The ground around the trailer was hard-packed dirt and gravel, and we couldn't find any clear footprints, but there was a spot near the front door where the gravel seemed disturbed, pushed aside in a way that didn't look natural. I remembered the window the face had been looking through, and we decided to measure how high it was. From the ground to the window was exactly 7 feet 6 inches. There were no steps or anything to stand on in front of that door, just flat ground. Whatever I'd seen had to be at least that tall to look through the window like it did. I drove home later that morning. Mike didn't want to stay alone in the trailer, so he went to his parents' main house to wait for them to return. We promised each other we'd figure out what we saw, but honestly, I didn't know where to even begin. I spent the next few weeks researching online. I looked up local wildlife, thinking maybe it was some kind of bear, but nothing matched what I saw. I read about escaped exotic pets, cryptids, even folklore about the woods in Mississippi. Nothing fit exactly. A month later, I found an old newspaper article about strange sightings in Jasper County dating back to the 1970s. People described seeing tall, hairy creatures in the woods that walked upright. Most were dismissed as bear sightings or hoaxes, but one account from 1983 described a creature with a face that looked almost human but wrong, and mentioned it made a scream that shook the windows. Reading that gave me chills. I've only been back to Mike's place twice since then, and never after dark. We don't talk about what happened much anymore. When we do, it's always in this half-joking way, like we're trying to convince ourselves it wasn't as terrifying as we remember. But we both know what we saw. That night changed how I see the world. I used to feel comfortable in the woods, used to think I understood the natural order of things. Now I know better. There are things out there we can't explain, things that exist in the shadows between what we know and what we don't want to believe. I still don't know what looked through that window at me that night, but I know it was real, and I know that just because something isn't seen often doesn't mean it isn't real. Sometimes the things we dismiss as impossible are just waiting for the right moment to show themselves, and sometimes they're looking right back at us through the window. Story 11. I've been debating whether to post this for a while now. It happened on June 3rd, 2020, and I still get this weird feeling in my stomach whenever I think about it. I've never been the type to believe in cryptids or anything supernatural, but what happened that day in the woods near Eagle Rock completely changed my perspective. I was home from college for the summer, staying with my dad. We live in Missouri, and I'd been wanting to check out this place called Deep Woods Preserve. It's this protected area with some really old trees, white oaks and short-leaf pines that have been around for centuries. I'm into photography, especially nature stuff, and thought it would be perfect for some shots for my portfolio. Dad wasn't into hiking that day, but offered to drive me there and wait in the car while I explored for a bit. The preserve isn't exactly a tourist hotspot. There were no other cars in the small gravel lot when we pulled up, just the way I liked it. I wanted those pristine forest shots without random people walking through my frames. "I'll honk when it's time to head back," Dad said, as I grabbed my backpack with my camera gear, water bottle and a granola bar. "Don't go too far in." I remember it was warm, but not hot. Maybe 75 degrees, with this perfect golden light filtering through the trees. The main trail was pretty obvious at first, packed dirt with occasional marker posts. I took my time, stopping every few minutes to photograph interesting formations in the trees or patches of wildflowers. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was the first person to walk there in months. There were sections where the trail almost disappeared under fallen leaves and new growth. About 45 minutes in, I reached this clearing with some of the oldest trees I'd ever seen. The white oaks were massive, with trunks wider than my car and branches that twisted in ways that seemed almost human-like. I spent probably 20 minutes just in that one spot, trying different angles and lighting setups with my camera. The silence was what got to me first. I'd been hearing birds and insects the whole way in, but in this particular area, everything went quiet. At the time, I just thought it was cool, like the forest was letting me work in peace. Now I know better. I decided to venture a bit further down the trail. It narrowed considerably, and I had to duck under some low-hanging branches. The trees were getting denser, blocking out more sunlight. I kept thinking I'd turn back after just one more photo, but kept pushing on. That's when I heard my dad's car horn in the distance. It was faint but unmistakable. 3 short honks, our signal that it was time for me to head back. I checked my watch and realized I'd been out there for almost 2 hours. I took one last photo and turned to start heading back. And that's when I heard it. At first, I thought it might be an echo of the horn bouncing off the hills, but this was different. It was a heavy, rhythmic pounding sound coming from somewhere deep in the woods to my right, off the trail. Thump, thump, thump. Like something massive was striking a tree with incredible force. The sound wasn't just loud, I could feel it vibrating in my chest, even though it had to be at least 100 yards away. I froze, listening. The pounding continued for maybe 15 seconds, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more unnerving than the sound itself. I'm not an idiot in the woods. I grew up in rural Missouri, and I know that the smart move when you hear something weird is to head back to civilization. So I started walking quickly back toward the trailhead, trying to move quietly while still covering ground. After about 5 minutes of walking, the trail curved sharply around a large outcropping of rocks. I was moving faster now, not running, but definitely hurrying. That's when I heard a loud crack to my left, maybe 20 yards off the trail. It wasn't a twig snapping, it was the sound of serious wood under stress. I stopped and turned toward the noise, my heart suddenly pounding. What I saw still doesn't make sense to me. There was this huge birch tree, probably 30 feet tall, that had been bent over, like bent completely in half. As I watched, the entire tree suddenly sprang upright with shocking force, as if something extremely heavy had been hanging from it and suddenly let go. The tree swayed violently as it returned to its upright position. Leaves and small branches rained down around it. I stood there, completely still, my camera forgotten in my hands. The trail curved just beyond where the tree was, so I couldn't see what might have been holding it down. But in that moment, I had the overwhelming sensation that whatever had just released that tree was now on the ground, just out of sight, and was aware of me. I've never felt anything like it before. It wasn't just fear. It was this primal certainty that I was being watched by something big, something that shouldn't exist. I didn't think. I didn't take a picture. I didn't call out. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. And for once in my life, I listened without questioning. I turned and ran back up the trail, not caring about the noise I was making. My backpack slapped against my back, and my camera bounced painfully against my chest. But I didn't slow down. I ran until my lungs burned and a stitch stabbed at my side. Finally, I had to slow to a fast walk, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't hear footsteps following me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was keeping pace with me, just out of sight in the trees parallel to the trail. When I finally spotted the parking lot through the trees, I nearly collapsed with relief. Dad was leaning against the car, looking annoyed until he saw my face. I must have looked terrible because his expression immediately changed to concern. "What happened?" he asked, as I stumbled the last few yards to the car. I couldn't even speak properly. "We need to go," was all I managed to say. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even open the car door. Dad had to do it for me. As we drove away, I kept looking out the back window, half expecting to see something emerge from the tree line. Nothing did, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched until we were miles away. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind. The tree was the part that bothered me most. I grew up around forests. Trees don't bend like that naturally, and they certainly don't spring back with that kind of force unless something really strong was manipulating them. When I finally told my dad what happened the next day, he seemed concerned, but skeptical. He suggested maybe it was a bear, but even the largest black bear in Missouri couldn't bend a mature birch tree like that. Besides, bears don't hide. If a bear had been there, I would have seen it. What really freaked me out happened a few days later. I was at the local diner grabbing breakfast when I overheard some guys at the next table talking about hunting. I wasn't really listening until one of them mentioned Deep Woods Preserve. "Wouldn't catch me in there alone," one older guy said. "Not after having a run-in with one of them back in '98. I couldn't help myself. I turned around and asked what he meant by them. The men exchanged looks, and then the older one asked if I'd ever watched that Bigfoot show on TV. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but no one else was laughing. "You had an experience out there, didn't you, son?" another man asked. "I can see it in your face." I ended up telling them what happened. When I described the bent tree springing back up, they all nodded like this was completely normal. "They do that," the older man said. "Use the trees like slingshots to move quickly through the forest without being seen. They're smarter than people give them credit for." When I got home, I spent hours researching. Turns out there have been dozens of Bigfoot investigations within a 30-minute drive of where I was. Eagle Rock and the surrounding forests have had sightings going back decades. I never actually saw what was watching me that day, but whatever bent that tree had to be massive, incredibly strong, and intelligent enough to stay hidden while observing me. No human could have done it, and no bear or other known animal would have behaved that way. I've gone back and looked at the photos I took that day. Nothing unusual appears in any of them, just beautiful old-growth forest. But in the last few shots, right before I heard my dad's horn, there's something odd about the tree line in the background. The more I stare at it, the more I think there's a subtle distortion there, like something large was standing perfectly still among the trees. It's been over 3 years now, and I still haven't gone back to Deep Woods Preserve. I've hiked in other places, but never alone, and never in areas known for strange sightings. Some things you only need to experience once to learn your lesson. I don't know what was out there that day. I don't claim it was definitely a Bigfoot or any other specific creature. All I know is that something powerful enough to bend a 30-foot tree was watching me, and for whatever reason, it let me leave. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, moving silently through those ancient trees, bending them to its will, and waiting for the next unsuspecting hiker to wander too far down that narrow trail. Story 12. I'm not someone who scares easily. 28 years as a hunter, 15 of those in some of the most remote wilderness in North America, and I'd always felt at home in the backcountry. The silence, the solitude, it was my sanctuary. But what happened in '91 near Gold Bridge changed everything for me. I still don't talk about it much. People either think you're crazy or they try to convince you it was something else. But I know what I saw. It was late. September. Perfect time for California bighorns in the Alpine Mountains. I'd been planning this 3-week solo hunt for months. The area wasn't new to me. I'd been hunting those mountains since the early '80s and knew the terrain well. My camp was set up at about 7,000 feet elevation, just below an alpine bowl where I'd spotted sheep in previous seasons. 7 days into the trip, I was sitting outside my tent after finishing a freeze-dried Salisbury steak dinner. Nothing fancy, but after a full day of hiking, anything tastes good. The sun was setting, casting that golden pink light across the mountains. I remember feeling completely at peace, watching the light fade when something changed. I can't really explain it well, but suddenly I felt like I wasn't alone. Not in the comforting way you sometimes feel in nature, but in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up, like something was watching me. I kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see a bear or maybe a cougar, but there was nothing. Just this overwhelming sense of being observed. I barely slept that night. Kept my Winchester right next to my sleeping bag, waking up at every little sound. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. Decided to spend the day scouting the adjacent bowl for sheep, thinking the activity would clear my head. What struck me immediately was the absence of wildlife. Normally I'd see mule deer, maybe some mountain goats in the distance, squirrels, marmots, the usual suspects. But there was nothing. No birds singing, no chipmunks darting between rocks. The whole basin felt empty, wrong. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know when something isn't right, and every instinct I had was screaming that something was off. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was sitting on a rocky outcrop, glassing the bottom of the bowl. The September sun was warm on my back, but I couldn't shake the chill that had settled in my bones. That's when I spotted movement about 300 yards away near a scree field. At first glance I thought grizzly. It had that brownish-black coloring and the size matched. We get a fair number of grizzlies in that area, so it wasn't unusual. I trained my Swarovski binoculars on it, expecting to see the distinctive hump of a grizzly's shoulders. Instead, what I saw caused me to literally stop breathing for a moment. The thing stood upright, not like a bear briefly standing to get a better look or smell, but fully upright, walking on 2 legs with a stride that was unmistakably deliberate. My hands started shaking so badly I had to set the binoculars down and take a few deep breaths. I've hunted bears, moose, elk, animals that can make your heart race when you see them. This was different. This was primal fear, the kind that reaches into your chest and squeezes. I picked up my binoculars again, forcing my hands to steady. The creature was walking toward a stand of jackpine trees, about 200 yards from where I first spotted it. Its gait was smooth but powerful, covering ground quickly. Without really thinking about it, I set down the binoculars and grabbed my .300 Winchester Magnum, looking through the Leupold scope to get a better view. What I saw through that scope will stay with me until the day I die. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I recognized from decades in the woods. The creature had arms that swung as it walked, but not like a human's. They were longer, with hands that seemed to reach almost to its knees. I could see muscles moving under dark hide. Not fur exactly, but a covering that seemed almost like very dark, matted hair. The thing was massive. Later, when I could think more clearly, I estimated it stood about 7.5 feet tall. Its shoulders must have been 4 feet across, with a chest at least 3 feet thick. The proportions were all wrong for a human, too big, too powerful. I'd guess it weighed close to 400 pounds, and none of it was fat. Just muscle layered on muscle. As it approached the tree line, something made it stop. Maybe it sensed me watching. It turned, slowly, deliberately, and looked directly up the slope. Directly at me. Directly into my scope. I've made eye contact with black bears, grizzlies, even a mountain lion once. This was nothing like that. Its eyes were deep set under a prominent brow ridge, intelligent in a way that sent ice through my veins. The face was Jesus. I still struggle to describe it. Not animal, not human. Something ancient. Weathered, dark, leathery skin, with deep creases around the eyes and mouth. The mouth itself was wide, lips thin. For maybe 5 seconds we looked at each other. 5 seconds that felt like an eternity. It knew I was there. It knew I was watching it. And it wanted me to know that it knew. Then, without any apparent hurry, it turned and continued into the timber, disappearing among the trees. I sat there, rifle still braced against my shoulder, scope still trained on the spot where it vanished, for I don't know how long. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour. My mind was racing, trying to categorize what I'd seen into something familiar, something explainable. But there was nothing. When I finally lowered the rifle, my hands were cramping from gripping it so tightly, my mouth was bone dry. I realized I'd been holding my breath and let it out in a rush. I should have left right then, packed up camp and hiked back to my truck. But some stupid part of me thought I needed evidence, needed to know for sure what I'd seen. So I made what was probably the most foolish decision of my life. I decided to go down there. The walk down into the bowl was the longest 300 yards I've ever covered. Every step felt wrong, like I was deliberately walking into danger. I kept my rifle ready, safety off, finger near the trigger. Not that I had any idea if a 300 Win Mag would even slow the thing down if it decided to come for me. When I reached the area where I'd first seen it, I found tracks. Not bear tracks, not moose or elk. These were bipedal prints pressed deep into the soft earth of the alpine meadow. 18, maybe 19 inches long. Broader at the front, narrower at the heel. 5 toes clearly visible in some of the better impressions. The stride length was enormous, easily over 4 feet between prints. I didn't have a camera with me, didn't have plaster to make casts. All I could do was stare at those tracks and know with absolute certainty that what made them wasn't supposed to exist. I followed the tracks to the tree line, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. At the edge of the jack pines, the prints disappeared onto rocky ground. I stood there, scanning the dark spaces between the trees, feeling exposed, vulnerable. The forest suddenly seemed malevolent in a way I'd never experienced before. I'd spent my life in these woods, and now they felt alien, threatening. That's when I heard it. Not a sound exactly, but a pressure, like the air was being compressed around me. I can't explain it better than that. And a smell hit me, musky, powerful, like wet animal hide mixed with something else I couldn't identify. I knew it was still there, watching me from the trees, waiting to see what I would do. What I did was back away, slowly at first, then faster, until I was practically running back up the slope toward my camp. I packed everything in record time, hands shaking so badly I could barely tie my bootlaces. Left the area entirely, hiked 6 hours to a completely different drainage to make camp for the night. I didn't sleep, sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap, jumping at every sound until dawn. When morning came, I hiked out to my truck and drove home, 2 weeks earlier than planned. For months afterward, I told myself it was a bear, had to be. Or maybe I was oxygen deprived at that altitude, seeing things. I came up with a dozen explanations, none of which fit what I saw. 2 years later, I was back in the area deer hunting, though I stayed miles away from that particular alpine bowl. Late afternoon, I was walking an old logging road when I heard it. A scream that turned into a roar that turned my blood to ice. I've heard bears when they're angry or hurt. I've heard cougars scream. This was neither. It was louder, deeper, more deliberate, like it wanted me to hear it, like it was telling me something. I ran back to my truck and never hunted that area again. I know what people call these things, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, but those names make it seem like something from a tabloid, something ridiculous. What I saw wasn't ridiculous. It was ancient, powerful, and absolutely real. I still hunt, still love the wilderness, but I'm never fully comfortable anymore, never completely at ease. I'm always listening, watching, waiting, because now I know we're not alone out there. And I know that whatever shares those mountains with us doesn't always want to remain hidden. Story 13. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family and closest friends because I know how it sounds. But I swear on everything I hold dear that what I'm about to share actually happened. This was on July 9th, 2021. I remember the date specifically because my buddy Chris and I had been planning this fishing tournament at Rife Lake for weeks. We're both pretty competitive guys, and we wanted to get out there early to practice before the actual competition started. We left my place around 4 in the morning. I'm an early riser anyway, but even for me, this was pushing it. Chris showed up at my door looking half asleep with this massive thermos of coffee, and we loaded up my truck with all our gear. It was still dark out, that weird pre-dawn darkness where everything looked slightly off. To save time, we decided to take a shortcut through some back roads near Randall, Washington. I've lived in this area my whole life, so I know these forest roads pretty well. Some of them are old logging routes that hardly anyone uses anymore except for locals. They can be a bit rough, but they cut at least 20 minutes off the drive to Rife Lake. The roads were deserted that early in the morning. We hadn't seen another car for miles. Chris was fiddling with the radio, trying to find something decent to listen to, but reception out there is terrible. We were just talking about our fishing strategy, which spots we wanted to hit first, that kind of thing. It was about 5:15 when it happened. The sky was just starting to lighten a bit, but it was still dark enough that we had our high beams on. We just turned off the main paved road onto one of those smaller gravel roads that winds through the thickest part of the forest. The trees were really dense on both sides, creating this tunnel effect, and the road ahead was narrow and winding. I remember glancing at the dashboard clock right before I saw it. About 70 yards ahead of us, something was standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it might be a bear, since we get those around here sometimes, but even from that distance, I could tell this wasn't right. This thing was standing upright, completely vertical, with its back to us. "Do you see that?" I asked Chris, slowing down the truck. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, leaning forward over the dashboard. As we got closer, moving slowly now, our headlights illuminated it better. The first thing that struck me was the size. This thing was huge, at least 6 feet tall, probably taller, and it was black, not dark brown like a bear, but black. The proportions were all wrong for a bear too. Its back was sloped at this weird angle, maybe 45 degrees from its head down to its rear. The shoulders were massive, really broad and muscular looking. When we got to about 50 yards away, it turned its head toward us, just the head, not the whole body. That movement alone made my skin crawl because it was so deliberate, so human-like, but not human at all. I can't explain it. The head looked small compared to the body, and in the headlights, I couldn't make out any facial features clearly. Just this dark silhouette with what looked like matted fur covering its body. Chris and I were completely silent, just staring. I'd slowed the truck to almost a complete stop. For maybe 3 seconds, we just looked at each other, us and this thing. And then it moved. The way it moved is what I can't get out of my head even now. It didn't run like a person. It didn't gallop like a deer. It turned and kind of lunged toward the trees on our right, and as it did, it dropped down onto all fours. but not like a bear would. Its arms, and they were definitely arms, not front legs, were longer than its back legs. It used its arms to pull itself forward, dragging its knuckles like an ape or gorilla would. It moved so fast that it disappeared into the tree line in seconds. I could hear branches breaking as it crashed through the underbrush. The sound faded quickly, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. "What the actual fuck was that?" Chris finally said, his voice higher than normal. I couldn't answer him right away. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I've hunted these woods since I was a kid. I know what bears look like, what cougars look like, what elk look like. This wasn't any of those things. "I don't know," I finally managed to say. "But it wasn't a bear." I started driving again, but slowly. Both of us were scanning the trees on either side of the road, half expecting the thing to come crashing out at us. Nothing happened, but that sense of being watched didn't leave me for the rest of the drive. When we reached a clearing about 10 minutes later, I pulled over. My hands were shaking. We both got out of the truck and just stood there. For a minute, breathing in the cool morning air. The sun was starting to come up, turning the sky this pale pink color. Everything looked so normal, so ordinary. But what we'd seen was anything but ordinary. "You know what it looked like, right?" Chris said quietly, not looking at me. I nodded. "Yeah, but I'm not saying it." "Sasquatch," he said anyway. "Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it." I remember laughing, but it was a nervous laugh. "Come on, man, that's crazy talk." But even as I said it, I knew that what we'd seen matched all those descriptions you hear about. The height, the sloped back, the way it moved on its knuckles. I just didn't want to admit it, because once you say something like that out loud, you can't take it back. We decided to continue to the lake. What else could we do? Turn around and go home. The fishing tournament was important to us, and part of me thought that if we just carried on with our normal plans, we could pretend that what we'd seen was just a weird shadow or a trick of the light. But we couldn't stop talking about it. All day, as we were out on the lake, we kept going back to what we'd seen, comparing notes, making sure our memories matched, and they did, down to the smallest details. The way it turned its head without moving its body, the distinctive hunch of its back, the knuckle walking as it ran. I couldn't focus on fishing at all. Every noise from the surrounding forest made me jump. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see it watching us from between the trees. The lake is surrounded by dense forest, and suddenly those woods seemed a lot more threatening than they ever had before. We ended up leaving earlier than planned. Neither of us said it was because of what we'd seen, but I think we both knew. The forest just felt different now, knowing what might be out there. On the drive home, we took the main highway. No shortcuts through the woods this time. We were quiet for most of the journey, lost in our own thoughts. "You know what's weird?" Chris said eventually. "I wasn't scared when we saw it, not really. It was more like shock." I knew exactly what he meant. Fear came later, when we had time to process what we'd seen. In the moment, it was pure disbelief, like my brain couldn't make sense of what my eyes were seeing. "Do you think it would have hurt us if we'd gotten closer?" I asked. Chris shrugged. "No idea, but it ran away from us, right? It didn't come toward the truck or act aggressive. That was true. Whatever this thing was, its first instinct had been to avoid us, not confront us. That was something, at least. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, second by second. I started doubting myself, wondering if maybe it had been a bear after all, or maybe even a person in some kind of costume, though that seemed even less likely out there in the middle of nowhere at 5 in the morning. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I started looking online for Sasquatch sightings in Washington. I was stunned by how many reports there were from the Randall area, dating back decades. Some of the descriptions matched exactly what we'd seen: the height, the sloped back, the knuckle walking. Reading those accounts gave me chills because I realized we weren't the only ones. Others had seen this thing too. I've spent a lot of time in those woods since I was a kid. I've been hunting, fishing, camping, hiking, you name it. Never once did I think there might be something out there that science hasn't explained. I always laughed at those Bigfoot hunters on TV with their night vision goggles and their ridiculous calls in the night. But now, I don't laugh anymore. The thing that bothers me most is that I don't have proof. No photos, no video, nothing concrete to show people. It happened so fast, and we were both too shocked to even think about grabbing a phone. Not that it would have shown much in those pre-dawn conditions. Anyway, sometimes I drive out to those back roads alone, early in the morning before the sun comes up. I tell myself I'm just going fishing, but really, I'm looking, hoping to see it again, but also dreading that I might. I bring my camera now, just in case. So far, nothing. Chris and I don't talk about it much anymore. When we do, it's in this kind of hushed, serious way, like we're discussing something sacred or forbidden. We've told a few close friends, but most of them think we're messing with them or that we saw a bear and our imaginations ran wild. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was just a weird-looking bear. Maybe the early morning light played tricks on us. But deep down, I know what I saw. And it wasn't anything that should exist according to science. I still fish at Rife Lake sometimes, but I don't take those back roads anymore. And when I'm out in the woods now, I'm always listening, always watching. That feeling of being observed hasn't left me. Sometimes when I'm alone in the forest, I get this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like something's watching me from between the trees. And maybe it is. Maybe what we saw that morning is out there right now, watching and waiting, just as curious about us as we are about it. Story 14. I never thought I'd be sharing this online, but after what happened last October, I can't keep it to myself anymore. I've lived in northern Wisconsin for almost 20 years now, in a cabin that sits on 40 acres of dense forest, about 15 miles from the nearest town. Most people would call it isolated. I call it peaceful. At least, I used to. I've had strange experiences in these woods for years. Over 30 encounters that I couldn't explain away with conventional logic. But last October's encounter was different. It changed everything. It was the second week of October, peak hunting season. The morning air had that special crispness that only comes in fall, when your breath makes little clouds and the leaves crunch under your boots. I'd been up since 4:30, getting my gear ready, making sure my rifle was clean, packing some coffee in my thermos. I left the cabin while it was still dark, using my headlamp to guide me to my favorite hunting spot about a mile into my property. It's a small clearing with good visibility where deer often pass through in the early morning. I've got a simple platform about 12 feet up in an old oak tree. Nothing fancy, just some boards nailed together that I built years ago. By 6:15, I was settled in. The sun was just starting to filter through the trees, creating that golden light that makes everything look magical. I had my rifle across my lap, my thermos beside me, and was just sitting there watching the forest wake up. No phone, no distractions, just me and nature. About an hour in, I hadn't seen any deer, but I wasn't concerned. The patience is part of the experience. I'd taken a sip of coffee and was scanning the tree line when something moved in my peripheral vision. My first thought was, finally, a buck. But when I turned to look, my blood ran cold. Standing there, partially obscured by a cluster of pines, but perfectly visible, was something I can only describe as a Bigfoot. But this wasn't like anything I'd seen in those grainy photos or shaky videos online. This thing was massive, easily 10 feet tall, and the strangest part was its color. It wasn't the dark brown or black you typically hear about. This creature was silver gray, almost like weathered wood, with patches that caught the sunlight in an unusual way. It was standing just 15 yards away from my position, which is close enough that I could clearly see details that still haunt me. Its face was more human-like than ape, with deep-set eyes that looked almost intelligent. Its body was covered in long, coarse hair that moved slightly in the breeze. What happened next is the part I still have trouble processing. The creature, this enormous being that could have easily torn me apart, noticed me staring at it. Our eyes locked, and I swear to God, its expression changed. It looked embarrassed, like a kid caught with their hand in the cookie jar. The corners of its mouth turned up in what I can only describe as a sheepish grin. In that moment, all my fear transformed into something else, a bizarre sense of shared understanding. I actually laughed. It wasn't a laugh of humor, but of pure disbelief. The sound echoed through the clearing, and the creature's expression shifted again. It tilted its head, and I swear it looked curious. Then, in a movement so fluid it didn't seem possible for something so large, it turned and disappeared into the forest. No crashing, no breaking branches, it moved with the silence of a shadow. I sat there for at least 20 minutes, unable to move, my heart hammering against my ribs. My coffee had spilled across the platform, but I didn't even care. What had I just seen? I've been in these woods my entire life, and I know the wildlife. This wasn't a bear standing upright or a moose in poor lighting. This was something else entirely. When I finally gathered the courage to climb down, my legs were shaking so badly I nearly fell. I approached the spot where the creature had stood, half expecting to find nothing, convincing myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But the ground told a different story. There, pressed into the soft forest floor, was a footprint. Not just any footprint. This thing was nearly 20 inches long and 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The impression was deep, suggesting enormous weight. I placed my own boot next to it for comparison, and it made mine look like a child's. What struck me most was the detail. 5 toes, clearly defined, a distinct arch. This wasn't an animal print, it looked like a gigantic human foot. I took pictures with my phone, but they don't capture the feeling of standing. There, seeing physical proof of something that shouldn't exist. I searched the area for more evidence, broken branches, hair caught on bark, anything, but found nothing. Whatever this creature was, it knew how to move through the forest without leaving traces. That realization was almost more unsettling than the sighting itself. How many times had it been near me without my knowledge? I abandoned hunting that day and headed back to my cabin. My mind was racing, trying to categorize what I'd seen into something that made sense. I've heard the local legends about Bigfoot for years. This region has its share of stories, but I'd always been skeptical. Now I didn't know what to believe. The next couple of weeks were strange. I found myself constantly looking out windows, scanning the tree line whenever I was outside. I started keeping a journal of unusual sounds in the night. Wood knocks, whistles that didn't match any bird I know, the feeling of being watched. Maybe they'd always been there, and I was just noticing them now. Then it happened again, about 2 weeks after the hunting incident. It was a Tuesday evening, around 7:30. The sun had set, and I was in my kitchen making dinner, just some pasta and sauce, nothing fancy. My cabin isn't large, but the kitchen has a big window above the sink that looks out into the backyard, where I keep my woodpile and have a small garden in the summer. I was stirring the pasta when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being observed. The hair on my arms stood up, and a chill ran down my spine before I even consciously registered why. Slowly, I turned toward the window. There, illuminated by the kitchen light spilling into the darkness, was a face peering in. Not at eye level where a person would be. This face was hunched down, as if something very tall was crouching to look inside. The window is about 6 feet off the ground, which means whatever was looking in had to be enormous. I recognized it immediately as the same type of creature I'd seen in the woods. The same silver-gray hair, the same deeply intelligent eyes. But this time it was close enough that I could see the steam from its breath fogging a small circle on the glass. My reaction was instant and primal. I dropped the wooden spoon I was holding, and it clattered against the floor. The sound seemed to startle the creature, and in that split second when I blinked, it vanished. All that remained was the slowly fading circle of condensation on the window. I rushed to the door, grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the beam steady. I swept it across the yard, catching glimpses of an enormous shadow moving with impossible speed toward the tree line. Within seconds, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. The pasta water boiled over on the stove, but I didn't care. I stood in my yard for nearly an hour, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't a one-time sighting anymore. This thing, this being, had come to my home. It had sought me out. It had looked directly at me through my window. What disturbed me most wasn't fear for my safety. Strangely, I didn't feel threatened. What unsettled me was the obvious intelligence behind those eyes. There was curiosity there, awareness, understanding. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. This was something that had made a conscious decision to observe me in my habitat, just as I had observed it in the forest. Over the following days, I found more evidence around my property. Unusual broken branches, too high up to be caused by deer or bear, large partial footprints in softer ground near the edge of the woods. Once, I even found my woodpile rearranged, as if someone had been examining the logs and hadn't put them back quite right. I installed trail cameras around the property, hoping to capture proof of what I was experiencing. But here's the weird part. Despite multiple, additional sightings with my own eyes, the cameras never caught anything. It's like these creatures knew exactly where the cameras were and avoided their fields of view. The only unexplained images I got were ones where the cameras had been physically moved. The angles changed slightly from how I'd positioned them. The most mind-boggling aspect of all this is their ability to move. I've seen bears, wolves, and mountain lions in these woods. I know how wildlife navigates terrain. But these beings, these Bigfoot, move unlike anything I've ever witnessed. Despite their massive size, they can disappear in seconds, without sound, without disturbing the environment. How is that even physically possible? I've tried telling a few close friends about what I've experienced, but I can see the skepticism in their eyes. They humor me, sure, but they don't believe. And why would they? I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, felt that unmistakable presence. The encounters have continued, sometimes just glimpses through the trees, sometimes closer interactions like that night at the kitchen window. I've started leaving food out occasionally, apples, nuts, even some jerky. It disappears overnight. Could be raccoons or other wildlife, sure, but sometimes I find unusual arrangements of sticks or stones left in their place, formations too deliberate to be random. That October day changed my perception of these woods, of this world we live in. There are things out here that science hasn't documented, beings that have remained hidden by choice, not by chance. They're watching us, studying us, just as we would study them if given the opportunity. I still hunt these woods. I still live in my cabin. But now I do so with the awareness that I'm not alone. That when I'm watching the forest, something in the forest is watching me back. And sometimes, when our eyes meet across that divide of understanding, there's a moment of connection that transcends words. The strangest part, I'm not afraid anymore, I'm in awe. Story 15. I still have a hard time talking about what happened that day in 2015. It's been years now, but every time I think about it, I get this weird feeling in my stomach. Not exactly fear anymore, but this unsettling confusion that never really goes away. It was early November, just after Halloween. The weather was unusually warm for that time of year in central Illinois. Dad and I were driving from Morrisonville to Taylorville in his old Ford F-150. We made this trip all the time. It's only about 15 minutes on Route 48 if you're driving normal speed. Dad needed to pick up some parts for the tractor from the John Deere place, and I tagged along, because I had nothing better to do on a Saturday. We brought Rex with us too. He's our German Shepherd, about 5 years old at the time. Rex loved car rides more than anything, always sitting in the back seat with his head sticking out the window, tongue flapping in the wind. That day, though, he was acting different. Not immediately, but it started about halfway through our drive. It was around 11:45 in the morning. The sun was high, not a cloud in the sky. We were just chatting about normal stuff, the crops, my classes at school, whether the Bears had any chance that season. They didn't. Dad had the radio on low, some country station playing songs I didn't pay attention to. Everything was completely normal. Then Rex started getting restless. At first, I didn't think much of it. He sometimes got excited when we were getting close to town, but this was different. He wasn't excited, he was anxious. He started pacing in the back seat, which was weird because he usually just sits there calmly. Then he began whining, not loudly, but this constant low whine that made the hair on my arms stand up. "What's up with him?" Dad asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. I turned around to look at Rex. "I don't know. Maybe he has to pee." But Rex wasn't looking at me. He was staring out the windshield, his ears perked forward, completely alert. Then he started sniffing the air frantically, like he caught a scent of something. His nose was working overtime, and his whining got more intense. "Something's got him spooked," Dad said, slowing down a little. We were about 2 miles outside of Taylorville at this point, on that stretch of road just past the big cornfield, where it starts to dip and rise a little. Anyone who's driven that road knows the spot. There's this small rise, and then you can see the bridge that goes over the South Fork of the Sangamon River. Dad crested that small hill, and that's when everything changed. I'll never forget the way Dad's body language shifted. 1 second he was relaxed, driving like he had thousands of times before on this road. The next second, his entire body went rigid. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel. I heard his breathing change. It got fast and shallow. I followed his gaze, looking through the windshield to see what had him so tense. That's when I saw it. About 200 feet ahead of us, crossing the highway from left to right, was something. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was massive, standing upright like a person, but much, much bigger. It had to be over 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8. And the shoulders on this thing, impossibly broad, like a bodybuilder but wider. The entire body was covered in dark, shaggy hair. Not fur exactly, but longer hair, almost black, but with these reddish-brown patches visible where the sun hit it. The hair moved as it walked, swaying slightly with each step. And the way it moved, that's what really got to me. For something so big, it moved with this fluid grace that didn't seem possible. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you'd expect from something that size. It crossed the entire width of the highway in just 3 long strides. 3. The highway isn't narrow there, but this thing covered the distance like it was nothing. We weren't going that fast, maybe 45 miles per hour, and Dad had slowed down even more when Rex started acting weird. So we had a clear view as this thing stepped over the guardrail on the right side of the road. Not climbed, not jumped, just stepped over it like it was a small curb. Then it disappeared down the embankment toward the bridge. The whole thing lasted maybe 7 seconds. 7 seconds that completely changed how I see the world. In the back seat, Rex had gone completely nuts. He was barking and growling, jumping from one side of the car to the other, trying to see where the thing had gone. But he kept focusing on the right side, toward the bridge, even after we couldn't see the creature anymore. His nose was pressed against the window, and he was making these sounds I'd never heard him make before. Not just barking, but almost like he was trying to warn us about something. Dad and I looked at each other. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," was all I could manage to say. We didn't need to say anything else. We both knew we had seen the same thing. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that couldn't exist. But there it was, crossing a public highway in broad daylight like it was the most natural thing in the world. Dad slowed the truck even more as we approached the spot where it had crossed. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Rex was still going crazy, whining and barking, jumping back and forth across the back seat. "Stay in the car," Dad said, as he pulled over to the shoulder, right next to where the thing had stepped over the guardrail. "Dad, no," I started to say, but he was already opening his door. He got out slowly, looking around carefully. I unbuckled my seatbelt, ready to follow him, but he held up his hand, signaling me to stay put. Rex was scratching at the window, desperate to get out, but I held him back. Dad walked to the guardrail and looked down toward the bridge. From where I was sitting, I couldn't see his face, just his back. He stood there for maybe 30 seconds, completely still. Then he bent down to look at something on the ground. When he got back in the truck, his face had this weird expression, like he was trying to process something that didn't make sense. "What did you see?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "Footprints, but they're wrong." "Wrong how?" "Too big, way too big." He started the engine again. "And there's broken branches down there, heading toward the river." We sat there for a minute, not saying anything. Rex had calmed down a little, but was still whining, staring out the window at the spot where the creature had disappeared. "Should we call someone?" I asked. Dad thought about it for a moment. Who would we call, and what would we say? He was right. Who do you call when you see something impossible? The police? The game warden? Some cryptozoology hotline? And what would we tell them? That we saw Bigfoot strolling across Route 48 in the middle of the day. "Let's go into town," Dad finally said. "Get what we came for. Then maybe we'll drive back this way and take another look." As we pulled back onto the road, I couldn't stop looking out the window toward that bridge. The rational part of my brain was already trying to explain away what we'd seen. Maybe it was a bear. But bears don't walk upright like that, and they definitely don't have that kind of stride. A man in a costume. No way. Nobody makes costumes that realistic, and why would someone be out there in the middle of nowhere, crossing a highway in broad daylight? Plus, the sheer size of it. No human is built like that. We drove into Taylorville, got the parts Dad needed, but neither of us was really present. The whole time, we were just going through the motions. Dad barely spoke to the guy at the John Deere place, and I just stood there, replaying those 7 seconds over and over in my head. On the way back, we stopped at the same spot. Dad got out again, and this time I went with him, keeping Rex on his leash. He was still acting weird, pulling toward the bridge, his nose working overtime. We walked to the guardrail and looked down. I could see what Dad had seen earlier. There were definite impressions in the soft ground of the embankment. Not clear footprints like you'd see in mud, but these large, compressed areas where something heavy had stepped. And they were big, easily twice the size of Dad's boot. There was a path of broken vegetation leading down toward the bridge and the river. Small branches snapped, tall grass and weeds pushed down in a clear trail. Something big had definitely gone this way. Dad and I followed the guardrail until we could see under the bridge. The South Fork isn't very wide there, maybe 30 feet across, with trees and thick brush on both sides. We stood there for a good 5 minutes, scanning the area, looking for any movement. Rex kept pulling on the leash, wanting to go down there, but Dad held him back. "We're not going down there," he said firmly. I was secretly relieved. As curious as I was also terrified of what we might find. What if that thing was still there, hiding under the bridge? What if there were more of them? We got back in the truck and drove home. The whole way, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Dad kept saying it had to be some kind of animal, maybe a black bear that was diseased or deformed in some way, but we both knew that wasn't it. When we got home, we didn't tell Mom right away. It wasn't until dinner that Dad finally brought it up, trying to sound casual, like it was just a weird thing that happened, not something that shook us to our core. Mom listened, looking back and forth between us, trying to figure out if we were messing with her. "Are you serious?" she kept asking. "Both of you saw this?" We nodded. "And Rex saw it too?" "Rex sensed it before we even saw it," I said. She didn't say we were crazy or making it up, which I appreciated. She just said, "Well, I don't know what to make of that." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that figure in my mind, the fluid way it moved, how easily it cleared the guardrail. I kept thinking about those 7 seconds and how they didn't fit into the world as I understood it. I've spent years trying to make sense of what we saw that day. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, about the history of strange creatures in Illinois. There are stories about something called the Tuttle Bottoms monster near Harristown, not that far from where we were. There are Native American legends about tall, hairy creatures that lived near rivers and streams. But reading about it and seeing it with your own eyes are two very different things. Dad and I have talked about it many times since then. We've driven past that spot hundreds of times, always slowing down, always looking toward the bridge. We've never seen it again. We never reported it officially, though Dad did mention it to his buddy, who works for the Department of Natural Resources. His friend just laughed and said it was probably a deer that looked weird in the sunlight. But we know what we saw, and Rex knew what he smelled. It was real, it was there, and it doesn't fit into any category of animal that's supposed to exist in central Illinois. Sometimes I still have dreams about it, that massive figure crossing the road, moving with that impossible grace. In the dreams, though, it always turns to look at us before disappearing under the bridge. It never did that in real life, but in my dreams, it turns and I can see its face. And then I always wake up with my heart racing. I don't know what we encountered that day outside Taylorville. I just know that for 7 seconds, the world as I understood it changed, and it's never quite gone back to normal since. Story 16. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. I'm still not entirely sure what I saw that night, but I know it wasn't normal. It wasn't anything I can explain, and trust me, I've tried. I've spent countless hours researching, looking up wildlife in Northern California, talking to rangers, even reaching out to researchers. Nobody has given me a satisfactory explanation. This happened last November. I was driving home from visiting my buddy in Eureka. It was around 11 at night, and I was on Highway 101 between Orick and Klamath. If you know that stretch, you know it gets pretty remote. Tall redwoods on both sides, barely any streetlights and hardly any traffic that late. I was in my Jeep Wrangler, lifted with a custom suspension and 4 high-powered off-road lights mounted on the roof rack. Those lights are no joke. They light up the road for at least 100 yards ahead, which has saved me from hitting deer more times than I can count. The radio reception was spotty, so I had turned it off and was just listening to the hum of my tires on the asphalt. It was a clear night, no fog, which is rare for that area. The moon was out, but under those massive trees it was still pretty dark. I was cruising at about 55 miles per hour when I spotted something on the right shoulder, maybe 100 yards ahead. At first glance, I thought it was a bear. We get plenty of black bears in these parts, and they sometimes come down to the roads to scavenge roadkill. It looked like it was crouched down or digging at something along the edge where the pavement meets the brush. Nothing unusual so far, right? Just another bear. I've seen hundreds in my 12 years living up here. But as I got closer, maybe 50 yards away, the thing stood up. And it didn't stand up like a bear. It stood up smoothly and quickly, in one fluid motion that sent a chill straight down my spine. Immediately I knew this was no bear. I slowed down, not out of curiosity, but from pure instinct. Something in my brain was screaming that this wasn't right. The silhouette was all wrong. It was massive, yeah, but upright, completely upright with a human-like outline. But it was built like nothing I've ever seen before. The proportions were off. By now, I was about 30 yards away, creeping along at maybe 15 miles per hour. My headlights and those off-road lights were illuminating this thing, and I could see more details. It had these incredibly long arms that hung down past its knees. The torso was thick, barrel-shaped, but there was virtually no neck. The head just kind of sat there low between its shoulders, slightly sloped forward like it was part of the upper back. The whole body was covered in this dark, shaggy hair. Not fur like a bear. This was longer, matted in places, hanging off its limbs and down its back. The color was hard to tell exactly in my headlights, but it looked dark brown or black. I was down to maybe 5 miles per hour now, about 15 to 20 yards away. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I wasn't thinking clearly. Part of me wanted to speed up and get the hell out of there, and another part was frozen in disbelief, trying to process what I was seeing. That's when it moved. God, the way it moved. It didn't run away like a startled animal. It didn't awkwardly lumber off like a bear would. This thing, in one single powerful movement, leapt from the shoulder of the road straight into the dense trees and undergrowth. One massive jump. It cleared at least 15 feet in a single bound from standing still. No running start, no preparation. Just this explosive, athletic movement that something that size shouldn't be capable of. And then it was gone, vanished into the pitch-black forest without making a sound. No crashing through underbrush, no breaking branches, nothing, like it had never been there at all. I sat there in my Jeep, engine idling, for what felt like forever but was probably only a minute or two. My whole body was covered in goosebumps. I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched, like there were eyes on me from somewhere in those dark trees. I've lived in Northern California all my life. I've hunted, fished, hiked and camped all over these mountains. I've seen black bears, mountain lions, elk, everything that lives in these forests. This wasn't any of those. The size is what keeps coming back to me. My Jeep stands about 6.5 feet tall with the lift kit. This thing was noticeably taller than my vehicle. If I had to guess, maybe 7.5 feet. And the build, not thin, not fat, just massive, powerful. Like a bodybuilder crossed with a linebacker, but bigger. I finally snapped out of it and hit the gas, not stopping until I got home. I didn't tell anyone for days. What was I supposed to say? Hey, I think I saw Bigfoot on Highway 101. I'd sound insane. But the image wouldn't leave my head. I couldn't sleep that night or for several nights after. I kept going over every detail, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me. Was it just a bear standing weird? A guy in a costume? Some kind of elaborate prank? A week later, I drove back to that spot in broad daylight. I pulled over exactly where I'd seen the thing and got out to look around. The ground was hard-packed dirt and gravel on the shoulder, so there were no footprints or anything obvious. But about 10 feet from the road, I found where something had disturbed the underbrush. Branches were broken about 7 feet up, not snapped from below like a bear would do, but broken from above, like something big had pushed through. I took some pictures, but they don't show much. Just some broken branches that could have been anything. But being there, seeing the actual spot, confirmed for me that I hadn't imagined it. Since then, I've spent countless hours online reading about similar sightings in Northern California. The Klamath area has a history of strange encounters. The local Native American tribes have stories going back centuries about tall, hairy forest beings. Loggers, hunters, and drivers have reported similar sightings for decades. I used to laugh at those stories. Not anymore. One detail that really stuck with me was how quiet it was. This massive creature, probably weighing hundreds of pounds, moved through dense forest without making a sound. That's not normal. Every large animal I've ever encountered in the woods makes noise, snapping twigs, rustling leaves, something. This thing was completely silent, and the way it jumped, that explosive power. Bears can't do that, humans certainly can't. Mountain lions can leap like that, but they're not 7 feet tall and covered in shaggy hair. The eyes are another thing that bothers me. I never clearly saw its face or eyes, but I had this overwhelming feeling of intelligence. Not animal intelligence, but something aware. Something that was observing me as much as I was observing it. That's the part that gives me chills even now, months later. I've told a few close friends since then. Most think I saw a bear in weird lighting conditions, or that my mind filled in details that weren't there. One friend suggested it could have been someone in a ghillie suit, like hunters sometimes wear, but that doesn't explain the height or that incredible leap. A couple weeks after it happened, I contacted a park ranger I know and described what I'd seen without mentioning anything about Bigfoot or Sasquatch. He listened carefully and then got quiet for a long time. When I pressed him, he just said they get unusual wildlife reports from that stretch of highway every few years. He wouldn't elaborate. I also reached out to a wildlife biologist at Humboldt State University. She was more dismissive, suggesting I'd seen a bear with mange, which can make them look strange and less furry, or possibly a large elk from an unusual angle, but neither explanation matches what I saw. The thing is, I'm not some gullible person looking for Bigfoot. I wasn't out hunting for the paranormal. I'm a normal guy with a regular job who happened to see something I can't explain while driving home. I wasn't drinking, I wasn't tired, and I had a clear view with powerful lights. It's changed me, this encounter. I don't drive that road at night anymore. I take the longer route through more populated areas. When I go hiking, I carry bear spray now, and I'm always looking over my shoulder. That feeling of being watched hasn't completely gone away. Sometimes I wish I'd had my phone ready to take a video, but honestly, in that moment, grabbing my phone was the furthest thing from my mind. I was completely frozen, just trying to process what I was seeing. I still don't know what it was. A known animal behaving strangely? Some undiscovered species? Something else entirely? I don't have answers. All I know is what I saw, and it doesn't fit with anything I've been able to find in scientific literature. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm just putting this out there because keeping it to myself has been driving me crazy. Maybe someone else has seen something similar in that area. Maybe there's an explanation I haven't thought of. Or maybe there are things in those ancient forests that we still don't understand. Things that know how to stay hidden, that only show themselves briefly and by accident. All I know is, I saw something on Highway 101 that night that shouldn't exist according to everything I've been taught. And every time I drive past those dense, dark tree lines now, I can't help but wonder what else might be watching from just beyond the reach of my headlights.